Imagine stepping into the 7th century, where the air smells faintly of coal smoke, perfume and judgment. You're in Victorian Britain, the world's reigning champion of decorum. Everything you do, from how you breathe to how you blink, is quietly observed and silently graded. The Industrial Revolution might be forging railways and empires, but social survival, that's powered entirely by etiquette. Forget survival of the fittest, this is survival of the politest. In Victorian society, manners weren't just niceties, they were the infrastructure of civilization. Without them, the empire might as well collapse into chaos, or worse, into middle-class behaviour. The upper classes treated etiquette as both armour and weapon. Armour against suspicion that you weren't truly refined, and a weapon to slice through anyone who didn't know the proper order of teaspoons. In the eyes of the Victorians, politeness wasn't about kindness. It was about control. Civilization, they believed, was a fragile teacup, beautiful, delicate, and always one tremor away from smashing. Hello, travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. A single wrong bow could make you invisible faster than a magician's rabbit. One unrefined good evening delivered at the wrong pitch, and you'd find invitations suddenly drying up faster than the punch bowl at a temperance meeting. The rules were designed to separate the somebodies from the nobodies. Every curtsy, gesture and cough had its proper place, and stepping out of line wasn't just embarrassing, it was existentially dangerous. Let's be clear, etiquette was not about making people comfortable, it was about making people predictable. Imagine trying to navigate social life where every move is a potential landmine. There's a precise distance for standing while talking, too close you're improper, too far you're rude, a correct number of times to knock on a door, and even an acceptable volume for laughter. Too loud and you're a drunk uncle, too quiet and you're plotting something. To be Victorian was to live in constant performance like a stage actor whose script was written by Queen Victoria's sense of propriety herself. But here's the twist. Everyone secretly knew it was ridiculous. Yet they kept at it because etiquette wasn't just habit, it was currency. Manners could get you into rooms where money couldn't. You could be a millionaire industrialist. But if you didn't know how to hold a fork, you'd be treated like a barbarian who just invented it. Politeness was the ultimate class elevator, but it came with one rule: if you had to try, you were already failing. The obsession with manners came from a deep fear of social collapse. The Victorians were living through rapid change, factories booming, cities swelling, people moving between classes. The old aristocrats looked at the rising middle class and thought, "Dear God, they're multiplying." So they built a fortress of etiquette, hundreds of invisible walls made of posture, diction, and tea schedules to keep society orderly. Think of it as an early form of social password protection. Every gesture was a coded message. Opening a door for someone wasn't just polite, it was proof you understood the grand choreography of existence. A man offering his arm to a lady wasn't just escorting her. He was declaring, "Behold, I'm civilized and unlikely to burp in public." Etiquette, in short, was a language where silence screamed volumes and teacups spoke fluently. And this language had to be learned early. Parents drilled it into their children the way soldiers learn drills. Manners make the man wasn't just a saying, it was a warning. Forgetting to remove your hat indoors could ruin your reputation for months. Imagine walking into a drawing room, realizing too late you've committed hat-related blasphemy, and feeling every monocle turn your way. You'd wish for the sweet release of cholera. Even sincerity had to be properly disguised. Compliments were expected to sound effortless yet hollow. You couldn't say, "You look beautiful tonight." That was practically a proposal. Instead, something like, "You appear quite well this evening, Mrs. Pembroke," would suffice. Enough warmth to imply you're not dead, but enough distance to remind everyone that you're not common. It was an age that truly believed civilization could be measured by restraint. Passion was dangerous, enthusiasm vulgar, and spontaneity downright scandalous. A Victorian gentleman didn't laugh, he chuckled modestly. A lady didn't show emotion, she fainted tastefully. Society functioned on the assumption that the more unnatural you looked and acted, the more civilized you must be. And yet there was beauty in this absurdity. The endless rituals gave structure to a world spinning into modern chaos. Railways were erasing distances. Newspapers spread gossip in hours. Factories blurred class lines. But etiquette slowed time, turning every handshake and tea party into a ritual of order against the noise of progress. So as you tighten your imaginary corset and adjust your moral monocle, remember this. The Victorians weren't just living, they were performing history. Every curtsy, every controlled cough, every precisely folded napkin was their way of saying, "We are not animals, we are civilization in silk gloves." Of course, behind those gloves, sweaty palms, clenched teeth, and the quiet panic of wondering if they just used the wrong fork. Welcome to the age of manners, where everyone was terrified of being impolite, and where silence was the loudest thing you could possibly say. Before a Victorian child learned to read, they learned to behave, and by behave, we mean sit perfectly still while life happened around them. In the empire where manners were more valuable than inheritance, children weren't born into innocence. They were born into a syllabus of self-restraint. If you cried too loudly, you'd be reminded that noise is the mark of the savage. If you laughed too freely, you'd be informed that joy should always be private, preferably experienced alone in your room quietly between 4 and 4:15. Victorian parenting was essentially social engineering with lace collars. A child wasn't a child, they were a future moral pamphlet in human form. By age 6, you were expected to sit upright at the table, eat neatly with your right hand, and never under any circumstances talk unless directly spoken to. And if you were spoken to, you'd better respond with the delicacy of a Swiss clock and the humility of a church pew. For upper and middle class families, etiquette training began before you could even pronounce etiquette. Governesses, nannies and tutors turned daily life into a curriculum of control. Books with delightful titles like The Young Lady's Book of Etiquette, or hints on the repression of youthful levity filled nursery shelves. These guides were less about teaching right and wrong, and more about ensuring your future dinner conversation didn't scandalize an earl. Physical discipline wasn't just about punishment, it was posture correction. Enter the deportment lesson, the most joyless PE class in human history. Children were made to walk with books balanced on their heads to perfect their poise. For girls, this trained them to glide gracefully into womanhood. For boys, to march confidently into manhood, both without ever betraying the inconvenience of having a spine. Slouching wasn't merely about posture. It was moral decay with a bent back. And so Victorian children became human chandeliers, decorative, delicate, and expected to stay in place. Even furniture had more freedom. Chairs were tools of instruction. Children were taught to perch on the edge, never fully relax, and keep both feet neatly together, as though they were about to be photographed by God himself. But deportment was only part of the curriculum. The real test was self-restraint. Emotion was dangerous. A sudden burst of laughter could derail your entire social trajectory. Imagine little Clara giggling at the dinner table because the family cat just stole a fish off the plate. Instantly, mother narrows her eyes. Clara, dear, composure is the virtue of the refined. Translation: stop laughing before the ancestors hear you. Humour was permitted, of course, but only the approved kind. Soft chuckles, well-timed smiles, and jokes about geography or the weather. Any expression of genuine mirth was a mark of poor breeding. Children were trained to laugh the way birds sing in a storm, quietly, anxiously, and at the right intervals. Then came the manners manuals, the bedtime stories of Victorian respectability. Every family had at least one. They contained strict instructions for everything. How to sneeze without sound, how to address an old cousin, how to walk through a doorway. Yes, that required technique. One particularly thorough guide warned young ladies not to look around a room too much, as it suggested idle curiosity. Imagine telling a 10-year-old to avoid looking at things. Victorians did it with a straight face and a stiff neck. For girls, deportment was destiny. A lady's grace determined her marriage prospects, her family's reputation, and possibly the future of the British Empire. She learned to curtsy before she could spell it. Hands were never to dangle idly. They should be folded neatly in the lap, as though expecting divine approval. Even how one fell was subject to etiquette. Fainting was practically an art form. If you lost consciousness, do it elegantly. Ideally onto a fainting couch, not a carpet. Carpets were for servants. Boys had their own brand of manners training. They were prepared for the world of clubs, offices, and parliament, where good breeding meant controlling not only your temper, but also your eyebrows. A gentleman's upbringing involved fencing lessons, for posture, not duels, supervised conversation with elders, and the all-important art of not interrupting. To interrupt someone older was social treason. You might as well have stormed the House of Lords with a butter knife. Working-class children, of course, had a very different experience, but even they were not immune to the infection of manners. Sunday schools and reform charities pushed moral improvement on the poor like it was a miracle cure. Posters in factories reminded child labourers to say please and thank you, as if politeness might cushion the fact that they were 12 and operating machinery that could eat them. The result of all this social engineering was a generation of children who could pass for miniature diplomats. They might have been terrified of everything, but they looked terribly refined while doing it. Portraits from the era show rows of solemn faces, stiff collars, perfect posture, eyes that say, "I haven't had an unsupervised thought since birth." But behind those obedient expressions were kids who sometimes cracked. Diaries and letters reveal small rebellions, little boys secretly making faces behind the piano teacher's back, girls sneaking laughter under their bonnets during carriage rides. These brief flashes of humanity remind us that even under the crushing weight of propriety, children were still children, sneaky, curious, and occasionally defiant, because no matter how many lessons they endured, how many teacups they imagined balancing, or how many lectures they received on the dangers of smiling too widely, they still had one undeniable truth on their side. Childhood refuses to stay still. Victorian kids didn't play tag, they practiced walking while pretending to balance invisible teacups. But every once in a while, when no one was looking, they probably ran anyway. In Victorian society, greeting someone wasn't just a formality, it was an Olympic sport with invisible judges, ruthless scoring, and lifelong consequences. You weren't simply saying hello, you were declaring your class, your breeding, your emotional stability, and whether your ancestors had ever committed the grave sin of being middle class. The wrong bow, the wrong handshake, or even the wrong level of enthusiasm could doom your reputation before you even reached the hors d'oeuvres. To the Victorians, greetings were a language unto themselves, a non-verbal Morse code of hierarchy. Every nod, curtsy, and hand movement had to be perfectly calibrated. There was nothing spontaneous about it. A proper greeting was rehearsed, timed, and executed with the precision of a military salute, but with more lace and less honesty. Let's begin with the bow and curtsy, the bread and butter of social choreography. Men bowed, women curtsied. But it wasn't as simple as bending your knees or lowering your head. That would have been barbaric. A gentleman's bow had levels. A shallow bow was for acquaintances, a deeper one for someone of higher rank, and a full, elegant bend for royalty. Bow too little, and you were arrogant. Bow too deeply, and you were either servile or, God forbid, French. The golden rule was to appear respectful without looking like you were auditioning for a job in their household. Ladies, of course, had the curtsy, a manoeuvre so complicated it could have been patented by a chiropractor. The goal was grace under pressure. The knees bent just enough, the skirt swept modestly, and the head inclined at precisely the angle that said, "I respect you, but not enough to wrinkle my dress." A curtsy too low was desperation, too high, insolence. In both cases, social catastrophe awaited. Some etiquette guides even advise practicing curtsies daily in front of a mirror. as though social survival depended on knee geometry, which in a way it did. Then came the handshake, a gesture that carried more meaning than most Victorian marriages. Among gentlemen, it was both a greeting and a declaration of mutual respect. The ideal handshake was firm but not forceful, confident yet modest, essentially a metaphor for British masculinity. Too limp and you were weak, too strong and you were uncouth, and whatever you did, never initiate a handshake with someone of higher rank. Let them extend their hand first or risk being socially vaporized on the spot. For ladies, handshakes were more perilous. A gentleman could not presume to touch a lady's hand unless she offered it first, a rare privilege, since most women were trained to offer only a subtle nod or a delicate curtsy. When a handshake did occur, it wasn't a shake at all, more of a light touch, like briefly confirming that both parties existed. And heaven forbid your glove be off. An ungloved handshake was practically an engagement proposal. Of course, in grand social settings, the introduction ritual was the gatekeeper of all greetings. No one spoke to anyone without a formal introduction. Two strangers meeting without one was the social equivalent of a street brawl. The proper script involved a host or hostess performing the ritual. Lord Pembroke, may I present Miss Everleigh? Cue boo, cue curtsy, cue the weight of centuries of expectation pressing down on both. Only after this ceremony could conversation begin, preferably about neutral topics like the weather, operas, or the moral benefits of soup. Even the order of greeting mattered. When entering a room, you greeted the highest-ranking person first, even if your best friend was across the room waving like a windmill. You acknowledged rank before affection. A duchess always outranked your emotions, and if you got the order wrong, you might as well have dropped your fork at dinner. Unforgivable. In public, greetings became a kind of visual theatre. On promenades, parks, or balls, the right gesture at the right time could elevate your social status. The wrong one could flatten it. Gentlemen tipped their hats to ladies, but not too vigorously. The hat tip was an art form, a brief lift, a slight nod, and absolutely no hat-spinning flourishes. This wasn't the Wild West, it was Kensington. Ladies responded with a faint incline of the head, small enough to acknowledge, brief enough to suggest, "I'm aware of you, but please remember, I am untouchable." There were also strict rules for non-greetings, which were just as important. Pretending not to see someone was a power move, a Victorian version of the scene message left on read. If you saw an acquaintance you wished to avoid, you simply adjusted your parasol, studied a distant tree, or appeared deeply interested in your own shoes. The ability to not notice people with elegance was considered one of life's highest skills. Every gesture, every movement in these rituals was charged with meaning, because greetings defined where you stood in the intricate social hierarchy. They weren't about warmth, they were about alignment. A perfect greeting said, "I know who you are, I know who I am, and I know exactly how far apart we stand." Behind all this choreography lay the great Victorian fear of embarrassment. Social grace wasn't innate, it was learned the hard way, through endless observation and occasional humiliation. Young men practiced bows before mirrors. Young ladies curtsied in drawing rooms until their knees begged for mercy. Because one public blunder could haunt you for months, people would whisper, "Did you see the way he bowed to Lady Cavendish, practically hit the floor?" And that was it, your name permanently engraved in the book of poor taste. And yet, for all its absurdity, there was poetry in this precision. Greetings turned ordinary encounters into ritual performances. In a world obsessed with propriety, the smallest gesture became a kind of art, wordless, choreographed, and charged with unspoken power. So next time you shake someone's hand too firmly or wave across a room without the proper curtsy, be grateful, 'cause in Victorian England, greet too low and you're desperate. Too high and you're French, both unacceptable. If you think managing your online presence today is stressful, try maintaining a social life in Victorian England, where your entire reputation fit on a piece of paper no larger than a biscuit. The calling card wasn't just stationery, it was social currency, moral evidence, and a miniature biography all in one. Lose it, and you might as well delete yourself from polite society. Forget likes or follows, Victorians measured popularity in card trays, and heaven help the poor soul who misdelivered theirs. A calling card, at its simplest, was a small rectangle of fine cardstock with your name, title, and sometimes your address printed in elegant script. But in practice, it was much more than an introduction. It was your public resume, your invitation to friendship, and your silent plea for relevance. A single card could open doors, close alliances, or spark gossip faster than any rumour mill. It was like LinkedIn, but with more paper cuts and fewer job offers. The ritual began with the calling hour, a period usually in the afternoon when respectable people went calling on others, not to be confused with dropping by. Oh, no one did not drop by unannounced. One presented oneself. Between 2 and 5 p.m, carriages filled the streets as well-dressed callers made their rounds. But they rarely stayed. You weren't expected to engage in conversation or even be received. The goal was to leave your card, tip your hat and move on, like a polite drive-by. Each household displayed a card tray in the entry hall, where visitors deposited their cards. Servants collected them like social mailmen, arranging them according to importance. A hostess could glance at her tray and instantly assess her popularity, or lack thereof. "Ah, the Smythes have called," she'd murmur proudly, before noticing the absence of the Wellingtons and spiralling into mild despair. The trays were Victorian dashboards, paper feeds updating your social standing in real time, and because Victorians loved hierarchy almost as much as they loved moral superiority, even the presentation of the card came with its own code of meaning. If you folded down the upper right corner, it meant you'd come in person. A folded upper left corner meant you were saying congratulations. The lower right corner was for condolences, and the lower left for farewells. A card left unfolded, that meant your servant delivered it for you. An efficient way of saying, "I acknowledge your existence, but not enough to appear personally." The etiquette didn't stop there. How you handed the card mattered too. Men presented their cards in the lower left hand, ladies in the right. Cards were to be held delicately, never brandished like flyers outside a nightclub. And if you were particularly well-bred, your servant would do the delivering for you, sparing you the indignity of appearing eager. The rules for returning a call were equally strict. If someone left their card at your home, etiquette demanded that you return the gesture within a few days. Failure to do so was the Victorian equivalent of being ghosted. People kept meticulous records of whose cards they'd received and returned, ensuring no accidental slight disrupted the delicate web of politeness. Friendship wasn't based on affection, it was based on proper stationery management. Of course, not everyone was equal in the card economy. The elite exchanged cards like diplomats, carefully balancing social exposure. Middle-class families desperate to prove themselves refined turned the practice into an obsession. Many spent small fortunes on engraved lettering, monograms and card cases made of silver or mother of pearl. It was the great social equalizer, until someone noticed the quality of your cardstock. Cheap paper revealed cheap breeding. You could have perfect grammar, stunning hair, and impeccable posture, but if your calling card was flimsy, society would know. The card's role in matchmaking was legendary. For young women of marriageable age, cards acted as gatekeepers of flirtation. Suitors could not simply appear. They had to leave a card with the lady's household first. The family would then decide whether to receive the gentleman, essentially swiping right or left with paper. For widows, special mourning cards were printed in black borders, indicating the proper stage of grief, thick black for deep mourning, thin grey for re-emergence. Romance, even after tragedy, was still a matter of proper timing and printing. The card case became an accessory of prestige. Ladies carried ornate silver or tortoiseshell holders that glittered like miniature treasure chests. Gentlemen favoured leather or brass, engraved with their initials. To fumble with your card case in public was social suicide. It suggested nervousness, disorganisation, or worst of all, unfamiliarity with etiquette. The smooth presentation of a card, however, marked you as someone in control, someone who could balance an empire of acquaintances on a fingertip. And let's not forget the servants, the silent players in this elaborate ballet. They became gatekeepers, trained to decipher the subtle messages left behind in folded corners and embossed names. A well-informed butler could summarise an entire week's social climate just by glancing at the tray. The Marchioness of Grantham called on Tuesday, the Llewellyn sent regrets, and Lady Harper left her corner folded, expecting a reply by Thursday. It was gossip disguised as logistics. In practice, the calling card system created both convenience and madness. People's lives revolved around keeping up appearances through endless circulation. Social diaries filled with scheduled calls, reciprocal visits, and notes about who must never be acknowledged again. The upper crust spent afternoons driving from house to house, distributing cards with military efficiency and returning home with dozens collected, a perfect day's networking. Yet for all its absurdity, there was genius in it. The calling card was the Victorian solution to small talk fatigue. You could acknowledge an acquaintance, express sympathy, or celebrate their engagement without uttering a single word. It was a whole emotional vocabulary distilled into cardstock. In a world terrified of emotional excess, the calling card provided just the right amount of detachment. So next time you stress about unread messages or unreturned texts, remember the Victorians, an entire civilization that built its social network out of ink and cardboard, and managed to turn dropping off paper into an extreme sport. Because in the age of steam and propriety, status wasn't posted online. It was left neatly on a silver tray folded at the corner waiting to be judged. If you think the Victorians fought their wars in Crimea or South Africa, think again. The true battlefield was upholstered, perfumed, and equipped with tea trays. It was the drawing room, that genteel arena where reputations were made, destroyed, and occasionally saved by a timely biscuit. Afternoon visiting wasn't leisure. It was combat disguised in silk and small talk. Everyone came armed, not with swords, but with calling cards, parasols, and the lethal ability to pretend to enjoy each other's company. The concept sounds harmless enough. You called on someone in the afternoon, exchanged pleasantries, sipped tea, and left. But beneath that calm surface, it was pure social Darwinism. The drawing room visit existed to confirm your place in the hierarchy, or expose that you didn't belong. And the rules? They were brutal in their precision. Sit too long and you're needy. Leave too soon and you're rude. Stay exactly 15 minutes. Congratulations, you've survived. Before entering the drawing room, a visitor had already passed several unspoken tests. First, the timing. Visits were permitted only during at-home hours, which polite society determined down to the half hour. Arrive early and you were over-eager. Arrive late and you risked interrupting someone of higher status. These time slots were even printed on calling cards. Mrs. Pembroke, Tuesdays 3 to 5, heaven help the fool who appeared on a Wednesday. Next came the entrance. The butler would announce your name like a royal decree, and you had exactly 5 seconds to cross the threshold and strike the perfect blend of confidence and humility. Too much stride and you looked common, too little and you looked uncertain. Women executed a graceful glide, men performed a dignified bow. The door itself was a test of etiquette. You had to enter as though the room had been waiting just for you, but you didn't know it. Now you were in enemy territory, the drawing room. Think of it as the social equivalent of a minefield disguised as floral wallpaper. The hostess rose slightly, never fully, she wasn't running a tavern, gestured toward a chair, and your fate was sealed. Where you sat determined everything. Too close to the hostess? Presumptuous? Too far? Disengaged. The prize seat was the polite middle distance, near enough to signal interest, far enough to suggest independence. The chairs themselves were part of the test. Many were deliberately small, fragile things designed to keep you upright and alert, lest you commit the mortal sin of lounging. No respectable person ever lounged. Slouching in a drawing room was the social equivalent of picking your teeth with a fork. Guests were expected to perch elegantly, hands neatly in lap, ankles together, and shoulders square enough to balance the weight of an empire. Then began the conversational duel. The opening lines were scripted, almost theatrical. How do you do was the mandatory greeting, not how are you, which implied actual interest. How do you do meant, I acknowledge your existence in accordance with custom to this. You replied exactly the same phrase, no additions, no emotion. It was the Victorian equivalent of nodding at someone in an elevator and hoping they didn't speak further. From there, conversation tiptoed through safe topics, weather or where acceptable, travel, preferably to somewhere respectable, and mutual acquaintances delivered with a mild praise. Politics, religion, money, or illness were off the table. Even compliments required restraint. You look very well was fine. You look beautiful was practically a scandal. The aim was to speak pleasantly without saying anything that could later be quoted against you, which was, frankly, everything. Humour existed, but only in the mildest possible doses. A pleasant jest was allowed, provided no one laughed too loudly or visibly enjoyed it. A host's worst nightmare was genuine amusement. It made the furniture seem undignified. A perfectly trained visitor could smile politely, chuckle once, and immediately resume the facial expression of a marble statue. The key was balance. Appear lively, but not alive. Tea, of course, was the central prop in this social theatre. The ritual of pouring and serving it could make or break a hostess. Sugar tongs, milk before tea or after. Every motion revealed your refinement. Guests were expected to accept their cup without clattering the saucer or spilling a drop, and to sip, not slurp. The teaspoon was to be placed at a 6 o'clock position, never 3, never 9. Those were the positions of anarchists. If you managed all this while maintaining polite conversation, congratulations, you were fit for civilization. Silences, ironically, were the most dangerous moments. In the drawing room, silence wasn't peace, it was accusation. Every pause demanded rescue through tactful chatter. That's why many visitors rehearsed conversational filler on their way over. The crocuses have come early this year, or I hear Lady Frobisher's spaniel has recovered. A smooth transition between weather and pets could mean the difference between being considered charming, peculiar. But the deadliest mistake of all was overstaying. 15 minutes was the unspoken rule. 16 minutes, and the hostess's smile became fixed. 17, and she started mentioning how busy you must be. 18, and she began glancing meaningfully toward the clock. Guests who lingered risked being labelled tiresome, a social death sentence. Polite society had no jail, but it did have exile, and it began with overstaying your welcome by 1 cup of tea. Departures required their own choreography. One did not simply stand and leave. That was abrupt. You waited for a conversational lull, rose gracefully, offered a final pleasantry. So delightful to see you. And retreated toward the door with subtle backward glances and measured steps. A bow or curtsy sealed the exchange, and once outside you could finally breathe again. For the Victorians, the drawing room wasn't just a room, it was a moral testing ground. Each visit demonstrated your breeding, your restraint, and your ability to endure tedium with a smile. Behind those velvet curtains and porcelain teacups, a quiet war of manners raged, one fought with posture, politeness, and an iron will disguised as charm. And when you finally made it back to your carriage, flushed with triumph, you could think proudly, I did it. I survived the drawing room. Just remember, there's another invitation waiting tomorrow, and next time the tea might be hotter, the silences longer, and the hostess even deadlier. In Victorian society, your clothing didn't just cover your body, it announced your identity, shouted your income, whispered your morality, and occasionally tried to kill you. Fashion wasn't vanity, it was vocabulary. Every button, lace trim, and feather placement was part of a complex social language, and heaven help you if you spoke it incorrectly. To dress badly was to mispronounce your own name. Clothing told everyone what kind of person you were before you ever opened your mouth. Class, virtue, marital status, and even your current mood could be decoded from the fabric on your back. The upper classes treated fashion like a secret handshake. If you knew the rules, you belonged. If you didn't, well, you might as well have walked into Buckingham Palace wearing flannel. Let's start with women who bore the heaviest linguistic burden. A respectable Victorian lady's outfit wasn't merely chosen, it was engineered. Layers upon layers of fabric, steel and hope were assembled daily to transform her into the ideal silhouette of the age, hourglass-shaped, upright, and slightly suffocated. The corset, that infamous contraption of whalebone and willpower, was both a badge of honour and a torture device. A tightly laced waist told the world, "I don't need to work, bend or breathe. I'm doing splendidly." The more uncomfortable the outfit, the higher the status. Pain was practically a fashion accessory. While working women needed mobility, upper-class women flaunted the luxury of immobility. If you could faint stylishly, you were winning at Victorian femininity. The logic was clear. The less practical your clothing, the more it proved you didn't have to lift a finger, because lifting anything heavier than a teacup might wrinkle your reputation. The corset was just the beginning. Dresses ballooned outward in magnificent displays of fabric supported by crinolines and bustles that could double as personal furniture. Skirts grew so wide in the 1850s that women had to pass through doorways sideways, like social ships navigating narrow harbours. And if you caught your hem on something, don't panic, just die gracefully. Colours and fabrics were just as socially charged. Lighter shades, whites, creams and pastels signified refinement, because they showed you didn't go anywhere near dirt or labour. Darker colours, except for mourning, were risky. They hinted at practicality, which was practically scandalous. Silk meant wealth, lace meant leisure, and cotton meant someone else's problem. Each material spoke volumes, often imported at great cost, just to say, "I'm richer than you, but in a tasteful way." Accessories completed the conversation. Gloves, for instance, were non-negotiable. A lady's hands were never to be seen in public unless properly sheathed, preferably in kid leather, so soft it could shame a cloud. Removing your gloves was an intimate act, reserved for meals or the faintly scandalous activity of playing the piano. To appear barehanded outside the home was indecent, unless of course you were a servant, then it was mandatory. Hats were another linguistic challenge. They weren't merely decorative, they were declarations. A wide-brimmed hat covered in ribbons and artificial flowers signalled youth, optimism, and a good marriage market value. A modest bonnet, on the other hand, spoke of piety and domestic virtue. Widows wore black veils so opaque they could attend social events without actually seeing them. And if your hat had feathers, the species of bird mattered. Cheap feathers screamed imper, while an exotic plume practically shouted, "My husband imports both tea and status." Then there was jewellery, the punctuation marks of the Victorian outfit. Pearls signified purity, diamonds, power, jet, mourning. Brooches were miniature billboards of sentimentality, tiny portraits of loved ones, locks of hair, yes, human hair, or religious symbols. A woman's body was less her own and more a canvas displaying the moral virtues of her household. Modesty required extravagance. The more you covered, the more attention you commanded. For men, fashion was no less coded, though it pretended to be simpler. A gentleman's outfit communicated wealth through restraint. Gone were the flamboyant colours of the Georgian era. Victorian masculinity demanded muted tones, perfect tailoring and an air of quiet authority. The respectable man wore dark wool suits, crisp white shirts, and spotless collars so stiff they could double as armour. Even his tie, the cravat, and later the necktie, had to be tied with mathematical precision. A man's hat was his crown. The top hat, gleaming and tall, was a statement piece of civilization itself. It said, "I have arrived, I pay taxes, and I am not to be trifled with." The bowler hat, by contrast, was for the middle classes, ambitious, practical, and slightly shorter, as if humility were measured in inches, and heaven forbid you remove your hat inappropriately. The line between polite gesture and social heresy was thinner than your moustache wax. Men's accessories also spoke volumes. Gloves, walking sticks, watch chains, each one a status symbol. A well-timed glance at one's pocket watch was not about checking the hour. It was about reminding others that you owned time, Even a man's shoes mattered. Polished boots for business, patent leather for the evening, and absolutely nothing squeaky. Noise was for the poor. Clothing also had moral implications. Modesty, purity, industriousness, all were woven into the fabric of Victorian dress. A woman who dressed too modernly risked being labelled fast. One too plain risked being invisible. Fashion was a daily tightrope walk between virtue and vanity, and both genders participated in the illusion that appearance equaled morality. Yet for all its suffocating absurdity, there was genius in this system. It was a social code everyone could read, instantly. You could enter a room and know exactly who outranked you, who needed impressing, and who was about to faint from lack of oxygen. Fashion was the Victorian silent orchestra, and everyone played their part, even if their corset made breathing optional. So the next time you curse modern dress codes, spare a thought for your Victorian ancestors. Trussed up, polished to perfection, and one sneezing away from social collapse. Because in their world, looking uncomfortable wasn't a problem. It was the whole point. Before the era of text messages, DMs, and emojis, Victorians had their own secret language, one that fluttered, folded, and occasionally fell to the floor. In the silent theatre of high society, where spoken words could destroy reputations and glances carried moral weight, communication needed subtlety. Enter the fan and glove, the most powerful flirting tools of the 19th century. When emojis didn't exist, people flirted by dropping gloves, literally and figuratively. Imagine the scene, a crowded ballroom glowing with chandeliers, waltz music drifting through the air, and 50 women in identical satin dresses trying to catch the same man's attention without ever speaking to him. Words were risky. They could be overheard, misinterpreted, or worse, appear forward. But a flick of the wrist, a brush of a fan, that was practically a sonnet. The Victorians turned accessories into an entire language of love, subterfuge, and survival. The fan, a seemingly innocent cooling device, was really a coded transmitter of social electricity. Imported from Spain, France, and the Far East, fans became a fashionable obsession across Europe. By mid-century, every respectable lady owned several, ivory-handled, lace-edged, painted with pastoral scenes or mythological nymphs that all looked suspiciously like social commentary. But their true purpose wasn't comfort, it was communication. Victorian manuals even published lists of fan signals, though most were passed down in whispers between women like state secrets. The movements were theatrical but discreet. Carrying the fan in the right hand meant, "Follow me." Resting it on the left cheek meant, "No." On the right cheek, "Yes," fanning slowly signalled, "I am married." While fanning quickly meant, "I am engaged," though not always to the man you were looking at. Opening and closing, the fan rapidly screamed, "You are cruel." Letting the fan drop, "We will be friends," a diplomatic way to end a flirtation before scandal bloomed. It was a silent soap opera unfolding across the ballroom. The fan, fluttering innocently, could carry enough romantic tension to power an entire opera season. Even men began learning to interpret the code, though clumsily. Many gentlemen were said to have misread a fan's motion entirely and mistaking, "Please stop talking for meet me in the garden." Such misunderstandings led to both engagements and duels, depending on the audience. But the fan's power wasn't limited to flirtation. It was also a weapon of social defence. During awkward encounters, it became a shield. A quick flick in front of the face could hide a blush, mask disgust, or, in desperate cases, prevent one's nose from detecting another's lack of hygiene. In an age of limited deodorant, this was not a trivial skill. Of course, a lady's fan was never to be handled by anyone else, especially a man. Doing so without permission was as intimate as holding her hand, or, in scandalous cases, more so. A misplaced fan left behind at a ball could launch an entire gossip campaign. "Did you hear? Miss Linton's fan was found near the terrace, and whose handkerchief was beside it?" The fan was both prop and plot device, its slightest movement dissected by the amateur detectives of the upper crust. If the fan was the poetry of flirtation, The glove was its punctuation. Gloves were the Victorian handshake, filter and flirtation device all in one. To appear in public without them was indecent. To remove them was significant. A gloved hand meant propriety, distance and social armour. A bare hand meant vulnerability, or invitation. Gloves kept everything in its proper place: germs, emotions and men's expectations. But gloves too had their language. To drop a glove was no accident, it was strategy. A woman could accidentally let one slip from her hand, knowing that the right man would stoop to retrieve it. This gave her a moment of eye contact, gratitude, and carefully scripted tension. The gentleman, of course, would pretend not to notice unless social standing permitted him to. If he returned the glove too eagerly, he revealed his interest. Too slowly, his indifference. The best suitors timed it perfectly, gallant but not hopeful. Removing a glove in company was equally charged. During a card game, it could indicate ease and comfort. During a dance, it was nearly provocative. A lady might subtly peel one glove away while talking to a man, exposing a sliver of wrist or palm. That tiny patch of skin carried the erotic weight of a modern movie kiss. Victorian society, after all, operated on the principle that imagination was far more dangerous than exposure. There were even glove-related blunders that could end social lives. Offering your ungloved hand to someone of higher rank was catastrophic. Failing to wear gloves in church? Unforgivable. White gloves in particular symbolised purity and class, so much so that middle-class climbers sometimes bought gloves 2 sizes too small, just to appear delicate. If blood circulation stopped, so be it. That was simply the price of elegance. Together, the fan and glove formed an entire lexicon of coded communication. They let Victorians express everything they weren't allowed to say aloud. Affection, irritation, rejection, even rebellion. They were props in a play of propriety, where every movement had meaning and every sentence could be seductive. And perhaps that's why the system endured. Because in a world that valued repression above passion, these small secret gestures allowed people to feel alive. Behind the lace and leather there pulsed a rebellion of emotion, beating in sync with every fan's flutter and every glove's fall. So the next time you see a fan flick or a glove drop in an old painting, know that it wasn't clumsiness. It was conversation. It was temptation disguised as etiquette. And in that genteel battlefield of glances and gestures, no one spoke, but everyone understood. Ah, dinner in Victorian high society, that glittering arena of porcelain, silverware and barely concealed anxiety. For the Victorians, the dinner table wasn't just a place to eat. It was a stage where civilization was tested with every bite. Each guest was both performer and potential victim in a play called Polite Society's Digestive Drama. One cough, one misplaced fork, and your social credibility could crumble faster than a stale pudding. One cough at the table and you weren't sick, you were scandalous. To dine among the Victorian elite was to enter a labyrinth of etiquette so complex it required near military discipline. The meal wasn't about nourishment, it was about demonstration. Every gesture, from unfolding your napkin to the angle of your soup spoon, was a coded message that declared your breeding. The wealthy didn't eat to live, they ate to prove they deserved to. Let's start with the seating plan, which wasn't merely about chairs, it was a declaration of rank. The host and hostess orchestrated the arrangement like generals plotting battle lines. The most important guests sat nearest to them, radiating out in order of diminishing prestige. The poor soul seated next to the second cousin of someone's dentist knew instantly they'd lost the social lottery. It wasn't uncommon for guests to spend the entire carriage ride home dissecting what their seat meant. I was 3 chairs away from the vicar's wife, one might sigh, which surely implies the hostess has forgiven me. Then came the table setting, which looked less like a place to eat and more like an archaeological site of silver and porcelain. There were so many forks, knives and spoons that one might assume multiple species were dining together. The golden rule was deceptively simple. Work from the outside in. But even that required intuition. Pick up the wrong fork too soon, and you revealed yourself as a barbarian. Pick up the right one too hesitantly, and you looked uncertain, so equally fatal. The soup spoon, for instance, was a villain in disguise. Etiquette demanded that one sip soup silently, and spooning away from oneself toward the centre of the bowl, a motion that defied both logic and physics. Slurping was forbidden, blowing was uncivilized, and letting the spoon clink the bowl was a cry for exile. Soup, in essence, was less a dish and more a trap designed to reveal your true nature. Then there was the napkin, a deceptively innocent square of linen that could condemn you in seconds. Fold it neatly on your lap after sitting, but never before the hostess did so. Dab your lips gently, never wipe, for heaven's sake, and if you needed to excuse yourself, leave the napkin loosely folded to signal your return. Crumple it, and you might as well crumple your reputation along with it. Conversation was another battlefield. The dinner table demanded charm, intelligence, and a complete absence of strong opinions. Guests were paired strategically for maximum compatibility, or entertainment. The man seated next to a widow might discuss literature, the lady next to a politician, the weather. To speak across the table was forbidden. It was like throwing verbal food. One spoke only to one's immediate neighbours, and topics were as limited as the corset's airflow. Politics, religion, and business were off limits. Even laughter had to be polite. A mild ripple of amusement, not the joyful explosion of someone who actually enjoyed themselves. Courses came in endless succession. The Victorian dinner could stretch over 10, sometimes 12 stages. Soup, fish, meat, game, pastries and puddings, followed by fruit and conversation steeped in exhaustion. Each dish arrived with a new set of cutlery because reusing utensils was barbaric. The table might groan under the weight of roasts, truffles and aspics, but guests were expected to behave as if they'd barely noticed. Eating too much was gluttony. Eating too little was insult. The goal was to appear as though you'd transcended hunger entirely. The servants, meanwhile, were silent stagehands in this gastronomic opera. They moved in synchronized precision, refilling glasses and removing plates with the grace of ghosts. Guests were forbidden from acknowledging them directly. Doing so was a breach of etiquette. You could not say thank you. You expressed gratitude through serenity, as if good service were part of nature, like gravity. Then came the most perilous moment of all, the sneeze. In a world that prized composure above all, sneezing was an act of social rebellion. A polite sniff was forgivable, but an uncontrolled sneeze, that was chaos. One was expected to stifle it discreetly, perhaps by feeling faint and turning away. A loud sneeze could derail conversation, startle the hostess, and draw scandalized glances that said, "We trusted you, and you betrayed us." The only thing worse was coughing, a reminder of mortality that had no place between the fish course and the blancmange. Drinking was equally ritualized. Wine glasses were arranged by size and rank. Claret, sherry, champagne, port, each with its own shape and purpose. A guest was to sip, not swig, and certainly never mix. Drunkenness, once considered roguish in the Regency era, was now the height of disgrace. A true gentleman could consume 3 kinds of wine without losing his conversational balance. If someone did begin to slur, the hostess would simply raise her fan, signalling the servants to remove the offender's glass and his dignity. Dessert was the victory lap. Conversation lightened, the laughter loosened, but not too much, and for a fleeting moment humanity returned. Fruits were peeled delicately, cakes dissected with surgical precision, and everyone pretended they weren't exhausted from 2 hours of maintaining flawless posture. Only when the hostess gave the signal, often a faint nod, could the ladies rise, gliding out to the drawing room for coffee while the men stayed behind for cigars and self-congratulation. Dining in Victorian society wasn't about enjoying food. It was about proving that you could survive under observation. Every fork was a test, every bite an audition. The table was a chessboard of status, and one wrong move could send you tumbling down the social ladder. So the next time you're at a dinner party and someone chews too loudly, take comfort. At least no one's judging you for spoon angle, napkin folds, or the acoustics of your respiratory system. In the Victorian era, a meal wasn't just eaten, it was endured elegantly. And if you managed to leave the table without spilling, coughing, or fainting, you didn't just dine, you triumphed. If the glittering halls of Victorian high society were a stage, then the servants were the invisible stagehands, unseen, unheard, and indispensable. The upper classes might have strutted through ballrooms in silks and satin, but behind every polished fork and fluffed pillow stood an army of people who made perfection look effortless. These were the butlers, maids, footmen, cooks, valets, and housekeepers who memorized every rule of etiquette without ever being allowed to use them. They were human furniture, except the furniture was smarter and moved faster. Victorian etiquette wasn't just for the people sitting at the table. It was for the ones who served it too. In fact, servants were expected to know twice as many rules, the ones governing their masters and the ones governing themselves. They had to anticipate every need, decode every gesture, and move through the house like trained ghosts. The perfect servant was omnipresent yet invisible, a being who could appear the instant a spoon was dropped and vanish before gratitude became a temptation. The butler, the commander of the household staff, was the very embodiment of restrained authority. He was expected to know everything, who outranked whom, which wine paired with which course, and precisely how many seconds a guest's glass could remain half empty before it became a tragedy. He spoke in measured tones, never smiled too widely, and moved with the grace of someone who knew he could lose his livelihood over a misplaced fork. To the guests, he was a symbol of refinement. To the staff, he was law. Below him in rank came the footmen, living ornaments whose appearance mattered almost as much as their efficiency. They were chosen not only for their competence but for their looks. Tall, symmetrical, and preferably without any distinguishing features like individuality. Livery uniforms made them walking emblems of the household's status. A wealthy family's footman was expected to look polished enough to reflect candlelight and quiet enough to make wallpaper jealous. Their job was to stand still until movement became necessary, which, in a mansion, was more often than you'd think. Maids formed the backbone of the household machine. Parlour-maids dusted rooms already cleaner than most operating theatres. Chambermaids changed sheets and scrubbed fireplaces, while pretending they didn't overhear the upstairs conversations about them. A good maid could fold a napkin into origami-level precision and vanish down a corridor faster than guilt itself. They worked in silence, not because they were shy, but because conversation with the family was forbidden unless spoken to. Some manuals even describe the ideal servant as soundless and scentless. Imagine being paid to be a human breeze. Then there were the valets and ladies' maids, the personal attendants to the masters and mistresses of the house. Their entire existence revolved around other people's wardrobes, whims, and breakdowns. A valet had to know exactly how his master preferred his cravat tied. The difference between correct and social suicide could be half an inch. The lady's maid, meanwhile, was both confidant and scapegoat. She dressed her mistress for dinner, soothed her tears after arguments, and quietly absorbed blame when her employer's corset was too tight. They lived close to privilege but never inside it, like satellites orbiting a planet they could never touch. The kitchen staff, meanwhile, existed in a world of heat and hierarchy. The cook ruled her domain with the authority of a general and the vocabulary of a sailor. Meals were planned like military operations, and woe to the scullery maid who chipped a plate belonging to the family's china set from 1782. Down in the kitchens, class lines were enforced with just as much rigour as upstairs. A kitchen maid couldn't address the butler directly, and the butler wouldn't dream of speaking to the scullery maid. Everyone had their rung on the ladder, even in the basement. But the real cruelty of Victorian service wasn't just the workload, it was the invisibility. Servants were expected to know their employer's every preference, secret and scandal, yet never exist as people themselves. They opened doors they were never allowed to walk through socially. They handled priceless silverware they could never afford to touch in a shop. They ironed gowns they'd be dismissed for wearing. And at dinner parties, they performed the most intricate ballet in Britain, serving the elite in perfect silence while pretending they weren't witnessing the farce of etiquette unfold before them. Servants also had their own unspoken code of conduct. Gossiping about the family was an unpardonable sin, though of course everyone did it. Discretion was survival. A footman who repeated a dinner table indiscretion could find himself between situations, the polite term for unemployed, by mourning. Loyalty was prized, but only so long as it didn't interfere with obedience. If a servant fainted from exhaustion, it was seen as inconvenient. If they disobeyed a direct order, it was moral failure. And yet, servants developed a mastery of observation that bordered on genius. They could read tone and posture the way others read letters. A butler could sense tension before a word was spoken. A maid could predict a guest's complaint before the first ring of the bell. Some even manipulated the delicate machinery of social life subtly, by seating certain guests closer together at dinner, or delivering letters just late enough to avoid scandal. In a society obsessed with etiquette, knowledge was power, and servants were the quiet custodians of all of it. Despite the relentless rules, there were moments of quiet rebellion. A cook might deliberately season a dish too strongly for a rude mistress. A maid might delay answering a bell by precisely 30 seconds out of sheer spite. These were small victories, invisible acts of defiance in a world where even following audibly was a risk. At the end of the day, after polishing the last candlestick and folding the last napkin, the servants descended to their own cramped quarters, places of laughter, gossip, and sore feet. There, etiquette loosened its chokehold. They could finally speak freely, joke, and even mock the people who ruled their lives. For a few precious hours, they were no longer invisible. So while the Victorians upstairs fretted over forks and phrasing, the true architects of civility were downstairs, unseen. They kept the empire's social machinery oiled, dusted, and perfectly in tune. Because in the grand theatre of Victorian etiquette, the applause always went to the actors, but the servants, they built the stage. If breakfast was about survival and dinner was about diplomacy, then afternoon tea was pure theatre. In Victorian high society, tea wasn't simply a drink, it was an institution, a performance, a social minefield dressed in porcelain and sponge cake. It was where alliances were built, reputations brewed, and scandals steeped to perfection. One false move, too much sugar, too little small talk, and your next invitation might never arrive. Pour too much milk and you're common, pour too little and you're French again. Either way, scandal brews. The concept of afternoon tea was born in the early 1840s, courtesy of Anna, the Duchess of Bedford, who decided that waiting until dinner, which Victorians insisted on serving at an absurdly late hour, was intolerable. She began inviting friends to join her for a light meal of tea, bread, and small cakes. What began as a private act of hunger management quickly mutated into a social ritual so complex it could only be British. Within a decade, afternoon tea was less about scones and more about status. By the late 19th century, taking tea had become the event of the day. Invitations were carefully curated, since the guest list defined the hostess's social standing. Being invited to tea wasn't about quenching thirst. It was about being acknowledged as relevant. Declining an invitation required both diplomacy and a believable excuse, ideally involving an ailing aunt or a prior engagement with the Queen. The first rule of tea was timing. Low tea or afternoon tea was served around 4, featuring delicate pastries, sandwiches, and an abundance of nerves. High tea, despite the name, was for the working class, served later, heavier, and with meat. Confusing the two was catastrophic. Imagine showing up at a duchess's home expecting roast beef instead of cucumber sandwiches. You'd never be asked back. The table itself was a stage, and every item on it carried meaning. A proper tea service included at least 2 teapots, one for strong, one for weak, a sugar bowl, milk jug, slop basin for discarded leaves, and enough cups to arm a small militia. The arrangement was symmetrical and strategic because nothing horrified a Victorian more than an unbalanced table. Napkins were folded precisely, teaspoons aligned like soldiers, and the centrepiece, a vase of flowers or a tower of petit four, anchored the performance. When the tea began, the hostess took centre stage. She alone poured, for tea was power. How she handled the pot said everything about her breeding. The wrist flick must be elegant, never hurried. The teapot should never, under any circumstances, leave its stand. Conversation continued as if nothing monumental were happening, though every guest was silently judging the hostess's pour angle. Serving tea wasn't just hospitality, it was choreography. Milk came next, and here the class divide revealed itself in liquid form. The eternal question, milk first or tea first, divided society like politics divides dinner parties. The milk-first crowd were practical types who wanted to prevent porcelain cracking from the heat. The tea-first purists, however, insisted it allowed one to judge the brew's strength. The latter, of course, were the upper classes. Milk-first drinkers were dismissed as servants, colonials, or, worse, people with no taste. Thus, a single pour could classify your entire ancestry. Then came the sandwiches, those tiny edible symbols of civilization. Crusts were the enemy. Size was everything, and cucumber reigned supreme. A proper sandwich was so thin it bordered on theoretical. Too thick, and you were accused of gluttony. Too small, and you looked stingy. It was an edible riddle wrapped in restraint. Sweet treats followed. Scones, eclairs, sponge cakes, all consumed with the same delicate precision. You didn't bite, you nibbled, as if calories could sense social shame. Conversation was the true sport of the afternoon. It had to flow effortlessly, but like tea itself, never boil over. The hostess opened with a neutral topic, the weather, a concert, or the latest charitable event, and the guests responded in kind. Gossip was inevitable, but had to be delivered with finesse. A proper Victorian insult was so wrapped in politeness that the victim might not realise they'd been skewered until the next morning. Lady Chalmers' new hat is quite remarkable, one might say sweetly, meaning she looks like a startled pheasant. The seating arrangement was a diplomatic masterpiece. The most important guests sat closest to the hostess. Those of lesser consequence were positioned at polite but forgettable distances. Servants moved silently, replenishing cups, clearing plates, and pretending they couldn't hear the barely audible sniping about who was wearing last season's gloves. The goal was to maintain serenity while everyone privately measured each other's outfits, posture, and conversational agility. Men, though less common at tea, appeared occasionally, usually politicians, authors, or husbands trapped by courtesy. Their role was to look dignified, say little, and avoid breaking anything. Tea was, after all, the female domain, and few men survived it unscathed. It was said that a duchess could ruin a man's career faster over scones than Parliament could in a session. But beyond the rigid rules, afternoon tea also served as a social equaliser, or at least pretended to. The middle classes adopted it eagerly, seeing it as their passport to respectability. Parlours across Britain filled with imitation silver sets and embroidered napkins. Women practiced pouring techniques and rehearsed polite laughter in mirrors. It didn't matter if your husband worked in textiles or your father ran a shop. If you could serve tea elegantly, you could appear refined. Victorian Britain ran on illusion, and tea was its most elegant disguise. For all its absurdity, there was something almost poetic about it. Tea was ritual, order, and escape rolled into one. In a world of industrial smoke and social climbing, this hour of measured calm offered a brief illusion of grace. The steam rising from the pot carried away the day's chaos, along with any hint of authenticity. So next time you dunk a tea bag without ceremony, imagine your Victorian ancestor watching in horror, clutching her pearls as you pour milk first. She'd see barbarism, but perhaps deep down she'd envy your freedom to slurp, because in her world, tea wasn't just a drink, it was destiny in a cup. In the grand bazaar of Victorian society, love wasn't blind, it was well chaperoned. Romance didn't bloom in moonlight, but under the watchful eyes of mothers, aunts, and the entire moral infrastructure of the British Empire. To the Victorians, marriage was the ultimate merger, love's answer to capitalism. And like any major investment, it came with rules, contracts, and enough supervision to make Cupid himself apply for a permit. Romance in the Victorian era was like applying for a mortgage, long, supervised, and full of judgment. A respectable match wasn't about passion, it was about pedigree. Families approached marriage with the same precision bankers reserved for ledgers. One didn't simply fall in love, one was presented to it, dressed appropriately and with financial records in order. The marriage market wasn't a metaphor. It was a functioning economy, and the main trading floor was the London season. A dazzling, exhausting carousel, balls, teas and garden parties designed to circulate debutantes like fine china. The season began in spring, when society's daughters came out, not as individuals, but as eligible commodities. The Queen herself set the tone. Debutantes were presented at court, curtsying so low before Her Majesty that many nearly vanished into their own skirts. From that moment, their social value was officially listed. The goal was simple: marry well before your youth, fortune or reputation expired, samobos, whichever came first. Courtship had rules so intricate that a minor breach could mean exile. A gentleman could not simply approach a lady and start a conversation. He needed a formal introduction via a trusted intermediary. Once introduced, he could request a dance, but only one at first. 2 or more in a row suggested unseemly interest. Too few, however, hinted that he found her unworthy. The social calculus was brutal. Express interest, but not too much. Be charming, but not emotional. Look attentive, but never eager. A flower words, romance conducted entirely on tiptoe. And then there was the ever-present chaperone, the guardian angel of propriety, except with sharper vision and no mercy. No respectable lady appeared in public without one. Whether at the theatre, the park, or the seaside, there was always an older relative hovering nearby, ready to intercept inappropriate glances like a professional goalkeeper. Young couples never walked alone. They strolled at a precisely measured distance apart under the moral supervision of someone knitting furiously nearby. The chaperone's role was to ensure that nothing unsupervised, spontaneous, or remotely enjoyable occurred. Flirtation itself was an art form, performed through layers of etiquette and fabric. Eye contact was a currency, too direct and it was indecent, too fleeting and it was invisible. Conversations revolved around safe topics, music, weather, or horses, but beneath the pleasantries coded messages simmered. A gentleman might comment, "I greatly admire your taste in lilies," which translated roughly to, "I am desperately in love with you, but trapped in a system that forbids direct expression." Written communication was equally treacherous. Love letters were permitted only after an understanding had been reached, and even then, they had to be impeccable in tone. Excessive emotion was vulgar. Misspelled words were fatal. Every letter was proof of character, examined by mothers and sometimes by servants before reaching its recipient. One careless adjective could destroy a future engagement. A well-phrased metaphor, on the other hand, could set the wedding bells ringing. Once a gentleman had established himself as a suitable candidate, meaning wealthy, respectable, and not recently bankrupt, he could call upon the lady's home. But even this was a regulated performance. Visits occurred during the family's designated at-home hours, usually between 3 and 5 in the afternoon. He was shown into the drawing room, offered tea, and subjected to polite interrogation by the lady's mother. The young woman herself sat nearby, contributing modest comments and occasionally pretending to embroider while her future was decided in front of her. Physical contact was practically science fiction. A gloved hand might brush against another during a dance, causing weeks of emotional fallout. A dropped fan or glove, strategically retrieved by the right man, could constitute an entire courtship. Any encounter more direct than that risked scandal, a duel, or both. As for kisses before marriage, strictly reserved for novels, and even then readers needed smelling salts. For men, the process was equally fraught. A suitor had to project confidence without arrogance, admiration without presumption, and stability without boredom. He was expected to manage horses, finances, and conversation with equal competence, a trifecta few could master. Proposals themselves were exercises in tension. Many occurred in drawing rooms under the quiet surveillance of parents pretending to read newspapers. A rejected proposal wasn't just humiliating, it was headline material in the local gossip circuit. Marriage, once achieved, wasn't the end of the ordeal. It was the closing bell of the transaction. Love was hoped for, but respectability was guaranteed. Husbands gained social stability. Wives gained economic security. True affection was a delightful bonus, like an unexpected dividend. Yet within those boundaries, genuine tenderness often flourished, not because of the rules, but in spite of them. Behind the lace curtains and the chaperoned walks, real emotions simmered quietly, determined to survive Victorian decorum. And for those who failed to secure a match, spinsterhood loomed, that dreaded state of permanent tea pouring and polite invisibility. Old maids, society whispered, as if independence were contagious. Men fared better. A bachelor was distinguished. A woman alone was a cautionary tale. Yet many unmarried women found freedom in the margins, running schools, writing novels, and enjoying the scandalous luxury of not asking permission. The Victorian marriage market may have been rigid, absurd, and smothered in lace, but beneath its ironed politeness lay universal truths, the yearning to connect, the fear of rejection, and the sheer comedy of human courtship. Strip away the chaperones and the dance cards, and you'll find the same anxious heartbeat that still drives romance today. Only now, the introductions happen on screens, and no one's mother is knitting in the background. So the next time you complain about dating apps, remember your Victorian ancestors, courting in corsets, flirting through fans, and signing their love letters with trembling restraint. In their world, romance wasn't spontaneous. It was scheduled. And if you were lucky, your reward was a proposal, a handshake, and a lifetime of very polite conversation. In an age when emotion was a public liability and self-restraint the highest virtue, the Victorians still found ways to flirt with ink. The love letter, folded, sealed, and trembling, was the most dangerous piece of paper in England. It was both an act of devotion and a social risk assessment. A word too warm, a flourish too suggestive, and your reputation could go up in smoke faster than the candle that lit your desk. Express your passion, but in neat cursive with appropriate margins and no visible emotion. Writing a love letter in the Victorian era required courage, artistry, and impeccable penmanship. Paper wasn't just paper. It was confession, currency, and confession of currency. Stationery came in shades of cream, rose, and pale blue, delicately embossed or scented. Each detail a clue about the sender's taste and respectability. Good paper whispered refinement. Cheap paper screamed desperation. The first impression was visual. If your letter looked vulgar before it was even read, you might as well have signed it. Yours in eternal disgrace. The actual writing, however, was a tightrope between sincerity and suicide. Love was to be declared, yes, but never with enthusiasm. Victorians believed that true feeling must be expressed indirectly, preferably behind 5 layers of metaphor and 1 layer of moral anxiety. A man might write, "Your presence brings warmth to the chill of my existence," which in modern translation means, "I really like you, but please don't tell your mother." Women had an even narrower margin of safety. A lady's letter had to convey affection without appearing forward, interest without immodesty. Society demanded that she be both emotional and affidable, like a novel censored halfway through. Even her choice of ink could betray her. Blue or black was acceptable. Red suggested impropriety. No one respectable bled emotion onto the page. Her handwriting was expected to be elegant but legible, delicate but not frivolous, calligraphy that could charm a man without alarming his relatives. Every sentence was a negotiation with propriety. "I think of you often" was safe. "I dream of you nightly" was scandal. Even yours truly teetered on the edge of impropriety. It could imply permanence. Safer options included "with sincere regards" or "with continued esteem," which had all the warmth of a handshake through glass. To express longing, one had to rely on subtleties, a slightly darker ink, an extra loop in a letter, or the faintest trace of perfume. Passion was measured in punctuation marks. Men, on the other hand, were expected to balance gallantry with gravity. Their letters were longer, more polished, and often carefully proofread by their secretaries or sisters. A gentleman might spend hours composing 3 paragraphs, pausing every few lines to consult a book of etiquette or to wrestle with his conscience. The finished letter had to strike the right tone, earnest enough to persuade, restrained enough to be shown to a father. Victorians didn't write love letters so much as submit emotional resumes. Once written, the letter began its perilous journey through the Victorian postal system, the most romantic and terrifying network ever built. The penny post allowed letters to travel cheaply and quickly, making secret correspondence alarmingly convenient. It also made scandal much easier to deliver. A misplaced address or a nosy maid could turn a harmless note into a neighbourhood incident. Countless lives were derailed by postal mishaps, envelopes opened by mistake, signatures misread, or declarations of love delivered to the wrong Miss Smith. For extra discretion, many couples resorted to elaborate subterfuge. Letters were exchanged by trusted servants, slipped into hymn books at church, or hidden behind loose bricks in garden walls. Some wrote with invisible ink, others disguised love notes as business correspondence. Regarding the shipment of lace, "You remain as Quon on my mind." Lovers became amateur spies, communicating through codes and misdirection while praying that no one found their archives. Even the folding of a letter was symbolic. A neatly folded sheet suggested self-control, a hasty fold hinted at passion. The wax seal too spoke volumes. Red was bold, white was pure, black was sometimes romantic in a mourning but still interested kind of way. Some people pressed tiny flowers or locks of hair between the pages, though this carried the grave risk of discovery. A found love token could end an engagement, or start a family scandal fit for serialization in the Times. Once received, the recipient faced their own etiquette gauntlet. Proper ladies read letters in private, ideally by lamplight, with at least one nervous glance over the shoulder. They often kept them tied with ribbons and hidden in boxes the way modern people hide search histories. If a relationship soured, the letters had to be returned or ceremoniously burned, preferably with tears. Burning love letters was considered both tragic and virtuous, one last act of dignity performed over the ashes of romance. Yet despite all the dangers, the love letter flourished. Why? Because it was the only space in Victorian life where emotion could breathe. On paper, people could say what they couldn't in person, confess affection, articulate longing, or even hint at desire. Between the margins of propriety, true passion flickered, restrained, repressed, but unmistakably alive. And perhaps that's why the Victorians wrote such magnificent letters, because repression made them poets. Every constraint sharpened the emotion, forcing love into elegance. They couldn't write, "I miss you." They wrote, "The hours pass with leaden wings in your absence." They couldn't say, "You're beautiful." They said, "Your countenance lingers in my thoughts like dawn in winter." You may laugh, but 100 years later those letters are still read, while most of today's texts have been deleted for storage space. So if you ever feel tempted to mock Victorian restraint, remember this. They built entire relationships out of ink and nerve. Their love was silent, spelled carefully, and sealed with a wax, but it burned all the same. Few arenas tested the Victorian soul quite like the ballroom, that glittering crucible of manners, motion, and mild panic. Beneath the chandeliers and swirls of perfume, young men and women navigated the world's most graceful battlefield. Here, One's future could be secured with a turn or destroyed with a misstep. To dance well was to demonstrate poise, wealth, and good breeding. To dance badly was social extinction with music. Spin too long and you're indecent. Spin too short and you're undesirable. Victorian dating in a nutshell. A proper ball began long before the orchestra struck its first note. Invitations were works of art, printed on heavy cream paper and sealed with crests that practically screamed lineage. To be invited was proof of social relevance. To be left out was a polite declaration that you'd vanished from the upper crust. Once received, the invitation demanded careful response. Accept too eagerly, and you looked desperate. Decline without excuse, and you risked offending the hostess. The only safe reply was a gracious acceptance that implied you were terribly busy, but might be persuaded to grace the occasion. Preparation was an event in itself. Hours were spent selecting attire designed not only to dazzle but to send coded messages. For women, gowns shimmered like social resumes, silks, satins, and the occasional flirtatious hint of décolletage. Gloves were mandatory, of course, extending nearly to the elbow, both elegant and hygienic, because who knew where your partner's hands had been? For men, the uniform of black tailcoat, crisp white shirt, and starched cravat was non-negotiable. The ideal gentleman was half statue, half verso metronome. Upon arrival, guests presented their dance cards, small decorative booklets tied with ribbons listing each dance of the evening. Beside each waltz, quadrille, or polka, a lady might pencil in the names of her partners. But it was more than a schedule, it was a romantic ledger, a record of intentions and alliances. The first few dances were usually reserved for family or close acquaintances, but the later ones, particularly the waltzes, were currency in the marriage market. To fill your card too quickly suggested vanity. To leave it empty hinted at failure. Introductions were sacred. A man could not simply ask a lady to dance. He required a formal introduction by a mutual acquaintance. Without it, even the most gallant bow would be met with the social equivalent of frostbite. Once introduced, the man requested a specific dance. Not just a dance, but the dance by number. "May I have the honour of the 5th waltz," he might murmur, offering both charm and a pencilled entry on her card. Declining politely was acceptable, but declining twice to the same man in one night meant you were sending a very deliberate message. "Find another card, sir." Then came the real test, the dance floor. The waltz, we imported from scandalous continental Europe, had already shocked early Victorians with its intimacy. Imagine hands placed on waists, bodies turning together. It was practically public indecency with violins. By mid-century, however, the waltz had been domesticated by etiquette. Couples maintained a precise, respectable distance, close enough to converse, far enough to discourage gossip. The gentleman led gently but firmly. The lady followed with fluid grace, her skirts floating like respectability in motion. But danger lurked in every rotation. A spin too long, and people whispered. A spin too short, and people still whispered. Step too close, and your morals were questioned. Step too far, and your coordination was. Every gesture was a balancing act, literally and socially. A skilled dancer could glide through the room exuding confidence and virtue. A clumsy one could ruin both shoes and reputation. For the wallflowers, those poor souls who lined the edges of the ballroom, the evening was agony. These were the overlooked debutantes, clutching empty dance cards and feigning interest in the wallpaper. The sight of a girl enduring 3 waltzes without invitation was enough to make mothers tighten their grip on the nearest eligible bachelor. Some sympathetic hosts invented group dances to include them, though everyone knew it was charity disguised as choreography. Conversation between dances was a performance of its own. While waiting for the next quadrille, a gentleman might escort his partner to the refreshment room, offering lemonade, always lemonade, never anything stronger. There, amid towers of blancmange and trays of sandwiches, they exchanged the mildest of pleasantries. Topics included the music, the decor, or how very crowded the floor was tonight. a phrase universally understood to mean, "Please notice me more." And heaven forbid anything go wrong, a torn hem, a broken fan, or, most catastrophic of all, a fall on the dance floor could become instant gossip. "Did you see Miss Trelawney lose her footing during the mazurka?" would echo through drawing rooms for weeks. Even perspiration was a threat. A gentleman who danced too enthusiastically risked damp gloves and eternal disgrace. A lady who fanned herself too quickly appeared flustered, which was only one small step away from forward. Behind the grace and the glitter, of course, was strategy. Mothers prowled the perimeters like generals surveying battle, watching for promising pairings. A dance wasn't just a dance, it was reconnaissance. Every spin, every smile, every glance across the room was analysed for marital potential. "Did you see how long he held her hand at the end of the polka?" was the Victorian equivalent of, "They're basically dating." When the final notes faded and the guests departed into the gaslit streets, the aftermath began. Dance cards were preserved like sacred relics, analysed for patterns. Whose name appeared more than once? Who was conspicuously absent? A gentleman who filled a lady's card and then failed to call within the week could find himself the target of an entire family's cold fury. A lady who danced too freely might find her name whispered off next season's guest lists. And yet, for all its absurdities, there was magic in those polished floors and careful glances. Beneath the scrutiny, genuine affection often slipped through. A shared laugh during a misstep, a whispered comment that crossed the line from courtesy to chemistry. Amid the measured turns and rehearsed smiles, real hearts sometimes dance to their own rhythm. So the next time you imagine Victorian romance as prudish and passionless, remember the ballroom, a world where love was choreographed, scandal was a step away, and survival depended on rhythm, grace, and nerves of steel. The dance floor was their battlefield, their dating app, and their stage, a place where every spin, no matter how brief, carried the promise of a future or the certainty of gossip. If the Victorians had a national sport, it wasn't cricket, it was pretending to be perfectly composed while dying inside. Public life in the 19th century was one long audition for respectability, a theatre without curtains, intermission, or mercy. You weren't just seen in public, you were evaluated there. Every stroll, every smile, every breath was a potential moral statement. Victorians didn't relax, they just paused attractively between anxieties. To step outside your home was to enter a stage set for the grand drama of class and character. The streets of London, Bath, or Edinburgh weren't just thoroughfares, they were open-air galleries of behaviour. One false move, too loud a laugh. Too quick a step, too friendly a glance, and you risked being categorised as common, foreign, or worst of all, improper. Reputation wasn't just built inside drawing rooms and parlours, it was maintained with every public heartbeat. Let's start with walking, which was not, as you might assume, a simple matter of moving forward. It was an art form, one part posture, one part restraint. A proper Victorian lady was expected to glide, not stride. Her movements should suggest elegance and composure, as though she had nowhere in particular to be and plenty of servants to get her there. Her gait was short, controlled, and utterly devoid of bounce. To walk like a lady, advised one etiquette manual, is to float upon air yet remain bound by decorum, which is a polite way of saying do it gracefully and for heaven's sake don't sweat. Gentlemen, meanwhile, were to walk with confident moderation, no swaggering, no slouching, and certainly no whistling. A gentleman's pace conveyed self-control and moral steadiness, as if the empire itself depended on his posture. To move too quickly suggested poor breeding. To dawdle implied idleness. One must stride with purpose, but not ambition. It was the locomotion of the moral superiority. Hands were another battlefield. A lady could carry a parasol, reticule, or fan, ideally all three, to occupy her limbs and deter fidgeting. Idle hands, after all, were the devil's calling cards. A gentleman could clasp in his hands behind his back or rest one on his walking stick, but never in his pockets. Pockets, as one etiquette book scolded, betray slovenly habits and an indifference to the presence of others, which is Victorian for you look like you've given up. Then came the art of the gaze. Looking directly at strangers was perilous. Women were cautioned to keep their eyes modestly lowered in public. To make direct eye contact was to risk being mistaken for a woman of forward disposition, i.e., not one you'd bring home to your mother. Men, conversely, were expected to maintain steady but non-threatening eye lines. Too intense, and it was impolite. Too fleeting, and it was weak. Staring was vulgar. Avoiding eye contact entirely was suspicious. The ideal was to look as though you noticed everything but cared about nothing. Public speech required just as much choreography. Volume was the first test of character. A voice heard across the street was scandalous. A whisper too faint to be understood was suspiciously secretive. The ideal tone was conversational poetry, measured, calm, and rich with restraint. Slang was social suicide. The word pants, for instance, was considered indecent. One said trousers. To a Victorian ear, informal speech was moral decay made audible. Even laughter was regulated. A soft chuckle was ladylike. A hearty guffaw was basically public intoxication. And heaven help you if you showed emotion in public. Crying, ungraceful, anger, uncivilized. Excitement, positively alarming. The face was to remain a marble facade betraying no inner turmoil. If tragedy struck, you bore it quietly, perhaps with a single tear glimmering in the corner of your eye, just enough to prove you had a soul, not enough to suggest you'd lost control of it. Victorians didn't believe in therapy. They believed in tight corsets and emotional editing. Even sitting in public came with instruction. A lady must never sprawl or cross her legs, ankles together, knees modestly aligned, spine straight as moral fibre. A gentleman could cross one leg over the other, provided the angle didn't reveal too much of the boot. That apparently was erotic. In parks or public gardens, benches became platforms for silent display. To sit elegantly was to advertise upbringing, to slouch was to declare yourself unfit for polite oxygen. Public transportation, that noisy invention of the industrial age, brought new behavioural challenges. Train carriages were arenas of forced civility, strangers shared compartments in close quarters, yet speaking to one another was frowned upon. Instead, Victorians spent hours pretending to read newspapers, staring out windows or silently judging fellow passengers' luggage. Etiquette dictated that one should not make eye contact, cough excessively, or, under any circumstances, discuss politics. It was the golden age of mutually agreed discomfort. Even shopping had its protocols. Department stores like Harrods and Selfridges became temples of polite consumerism. Customers were expected to browse quietly, request assistance gently, and never haggle. That was for markets and moral inferiors. Shopgirls trained in civility were to address everyone as madam or sir, even when enduring insults from customers who confused rudeness with refinement. The exchange of money, that most mundane act, was cloaked in ritual. Coins placed delicately in gloved hands or on trays, never slapped down. And above all hovered the omnipresent rule of self-restraint. Victorian society was obsessed with composure as proof of character. To lose one's temper or reveal one's true feelings was to strip away civilization itself. Even breathing was expected to be modest and shallow, silent, and above all contained. Etiquette manuals actually advised women not to inhale too deeply in public, lest it disturb the harmony of carriage. Also, corsets made it nearly impossible, so perhaps that was convenient advice. Public behaviour was more than mere vanity. It was survival. A single display of eccentricity could doom your social prospects for years. People didn't just observe you, they recorded you in gossip, the era's favourite medium. Every misstep echoed in drawing rooms, every unladylike sneeze reinterpreted by bored dowagers into moral decline. The streets themselves were mirrors, reflecting back an endless demand for dignity. And yet, within all this rigid performance, the Victorians found strange comfort. Etiquette provided armour against chaos, a shared script in a rapidly changing world. If one could walk properly, speak properly, and control one's face, perhaps society itself could hold together a little longer. So the next time you walk down a street mid-yawn or laugh at your phone in public, know this. A Victorian onlooker would have fainted on the spot. To them, the world was a stage, and you, a dangerously unscripted extra. In that finely tuned civilization of grace and grit, even stillness was deliberate. They didn't relax, they just performed rest, beautifully, anxiously, and forever. Sunday morning in Victorian Britain wasn't merely about worship, it was about attendance. Church was less a spiritual refuge and more a weekly fashion show where salvation met social strategy. People went to church for salvation and stayed for the social networking. To skip the service was practically atheism. To attend incorrectly was social suicide. The pew wasn't just a seat, it was a spotlight. For the Victorians, religion and respectability were inseparable. Morality had become the currency of the middle and upper classes, and church was where you displayed it. Whether Anglican, Methodist or Presbyterian, every denomination had its rituals, but all shared one common principle. God might see your soul, but everyone else was watching your hat. The morning began long before the sermon, with preparation that bordered on military precision. Clothing had to reflect both piety and prosperity. Ladies dressed in their Sunday best, literally the finest garments they owned. Gowns were modest but elaborate, stitched with more devotion than most prayers. The neckline mustn't plunge, the sleeves mustn't cling, and the fabric mustn't suggest worldliness. But don't mistake modest for plain. Victorians found ways to turn humility into haute couture. Bonnets grew large enough to require spatial planning. Veils hinted at mystery but promised moral fortitude. Gentlemen, meanwhile, appeared in dark suits polished enough to blind the parish clerk, topped with immaculate gloves and spotless shoes. God might not care about scuffed boots, but the vicar's wife certainly did. Then there was the matter of seating, which was not simply first come, first served. Pews were rented, yes, rented by the year, ensuring that the wealthy always had front row salvation. Families proudly displayed brass nameplates on their pews like titles of nobility. The Honour Cuthbert Smythe family, redeemed and respectable. Latecomers or the less fortunate found themselves in the back pews, squinting at the pulpit and spiritually downgraded by proximity. The very architecture of Victorian churches reinforced class hierarchy, comfort and visibility for the elite, drafts and bad acoustics for everyone else. Once seated, the rules multiplied. Children were to remain silent, hands folded, eyes down. Whispering, fidgeting, or showing signs of being alive were all punishable by glares that could wither crops. Men sat upright, hats removed, faces solemn. Women arranged themselves elegantly, ensuring that their bonnets framed their faces like divine halos. Even the act of kneeling had technique. Too quickly and you looked hasty, too slowly and you risked theatrics. Arriving late was unforgivable. To enter mid-sermon was to declare moral bankruptcy. The entire congregation would pause, heads subtly turning, expressions hovering between pity and condemnation. On the other hand, arriving too early suggested a worrying level of enthusiasm. Some even said it was Methodist behaviour. The goal was punctual grace, just on time, composed and faintly radiant. The service itself was both a performance and endurance test. The sermon could stretch past an hour, a length justified by the belief that longer preaching meant deeper faith. Parishioners were expected to listen attentively, or at least simulate it. Sleeping in church was the ultimate disgrace, though common enough to inspire inventive defences. Some men claimed to pray with eyes closed, while others kept Bibles open to disguise naps. Women used fans to stay awake, or hide yawns. Hymn singing was another delicate operation. A strong voice was admired, but too strong was theatrical. A lady soprano should float gracefully, like incense. A gentleman's baritone should resonate with restrained conviction, never enthusiasm. Heaven forbid you missed a note. Even God, it seemed, preferred good pitch. and when the collection plate came around, etiquette demanded visible generosity. The rustle of banknotes was ideal. Coins clinking against the metal tray were auditory confession of stinginess. After the service, the real liturgy began, the post-church promenade. Congregants poured out onto the churchyard path where pleasantries were exchanged, reputations updated, and invitations extended. It was society's weekly roll call, parade of hats, carriages, and strategic compliments. "So good to see you, Mrs. Linton. Your bonnet is divine," translated to, "I saw your new housemaid." And we both know she's not. Marriages were plotted, rivalries rekindled, and absences noted. A single missed Sunday could spark a week's worth of speculation. Illness? Disgrace? Or worse, visiting another parish? For clergy, too, etiquette was paramount. The vicar had to strike a balance between humility and authority, ensuring his sermons soothed the poor without offending the rich. He was expected to visit parishioners, bless infants, and occasionally condemn dancing, gently, of course, in case a duchess was listening. The curate, usually younger and poorer, handled the less glamorous duties, trudging through rain to deliver sermons in neighbouring villages and trying not to fall in love with the vicar's daughter. Even the architecture of worship reflected the age's obsession with decorum. The Gothic revival turned churches into moral fortresses, pointed arches pointing toward heaven, stained glass filtering light into respectable shades of repentance. Every element whispered order. Religion wasn't just faith, it was presentation. And yet beneath all the choreography there was sincerity. Many Victorians did believe deeply, even if their belief was filtered through lace and ritual. Their obsession with propriety masked genuine attempts to bring order to chaos, to find meaning in a world spinning ever faster with industrial progress. Church, for all its social manoeuvring, still offered solace, an hour of ritualised stillness in a life ruled by appearances. But make no mistake, in the pews of Victorian Britain, heaven and hierarchy met every Sunday. Worshippers prayed with one eye on eternity and the other on the congregation. Even piety had posture. You might go to church for redemption, but you left with gossip, opinions, and the faint relief of having been seen being good. So the next time you feel judged at a wedding or side-eyed at a holiday service, take comfort. You're just participating in a time-honoured British tradition, where faith was measured in decibels, hats, and how gracefully one could kneel without creasing silk. No one mourned quite like the Victorians. Death, to them, wasn't an event. It was a lifestyle choice. The moment someone breathed their last, the entire household transformed into a shrine of sorrow and starch. Curtains were drawn, clocks stopped, mirrors veiled, and emotion scheduled with bureaucratic precision. Victorians didn't just grieve, they managed grief. It came with manuals, colour charts, and strict expiration dates. Victorian grief came with a dress code and expiration date. The great architect of this elaborate sorrow was none other than Queen Victoria herself, who turned mourning into both moral duty and fashion statement. After Prince Albert's death in 1861, she retreated into black and never came out again. For 40 years, she lived as the empire's grieving widow, setting a national trend for funereal chic. Her wardrobe declared to the world that grief was not only noble, it was also in style. From there, mourning became the ultimate performance of respectability. Every social class, from dukes to dressmakers, followed a detailed hierarchy of grief. The mourning period varied depending on your relationship to the deceased and your enthusiasm for self-punishment. A widow's mourning lasted the longest, 2.5 years of sartorial sorrow. Parents, siblings, and children each had prescribed durations ranging from 6 months to a year. Even distant cousins got a week or two of symbolic sadness, provided you could remember their names. The timeline of tears was mapped out like a train schedule, and missing your stop was unforgivable. The first stage was deep mourning, a kind of emotional quarantine. For widows, it meant full black attire. No lace, no jewellery, no joy. dresses were made of dull matte fabrics like bombazine, crepe, or Parramatta cloth, designed specifically to absorb light and kill hope. The texture alone announced despair. Fashion magazines published entire guides titled "How to Dress Respectably in Sorrow," filled with sentences like, "A true mourner would no more wear silk than she would smile in public." Black gloves, black veils, black ribbons, the world became a monochrome expression of virtue. Even handkerchiefs had black borders, because blowing your nose in white linen was apparently insensitive. The second stage, known as second mourning, allowed for slight leniency. Fabrics could have sheen. Jewellery could reappear, provided it was made of jet, a fossilised black gemstone from Whitby that became the Chanel of bereavement. Jet jewellery adorned brooches, bracelets, and lockets containing locks of the deceased's hair, because nothing says eternal love like accessorised DNA. Veils grew shorter, and some daring souls introduced muted greys or lilacs into their wardrobes, shocking splashes of colour that whispered, "I am technically still grieving, but not enough to frighten dinner guests." By the half-mourning stage, life cautiously resumed. Greys, lavenders and mauves replaced the funereal black, signalling to society that you were ready to rejoin polite company. It was grief with training wheels. Etiquette books advised widows to begin attending small social gatherings, but avoid laughter until the spirit feels it naturally again, which, translated from Victorian, meant never. Only after the official period ended could colour, conversation and suitors return. One newspaper even referred to this phase as the reopening of the heart's drapery department. But mourning was not just about clothes. It was a social performance with rules for every occasion. Widows were forbidden from attending balls, concerts, or public dinners during the early stages of mourning. Even smiling too soon could provoke gossip. Letters had to be written on black bordered stationery, and envelopes sealed with black wax. Calling cards, too, bore black edges, thick ones for recent loss, thin ones for fading grief. Visitors were expected to express condolences in language so formal it bordered on theatrical. "Permit me to offer my sincerest sympathies upon your bereavement." Anything less poetic was emotional blasphemy. Men, of course, had it easier, as men always did in Victorian rulebooks. Mourning for them meant donning a black armband or dark suit for a few months, then moving briskly on. The widow's agony became his period of adjustment. Society admired the solemnity of widowers, but pitied the extravagance of widows. For a woman, mourning was not just expected, it was policed. Failure to follow the code implied moral weakness, perhaps even indifference to the deceased. And then came the business of mourning, which was as lucrative as it was morbid. Entire industries thrived on grief. Mourning clothiers, veil makers, undertakers and jewellers. Shops in London's Regent Street specialised in widows' packages, complete outfits for the recently bereaved. Mourning warehouses advertised garments ready at a moment's notice, as if death were a fashion emergency. Even hairdressers got in on the act, offering subdued styles appropriate for sorrow. The middle classes embraced mourning with almost competitive zeal. It was their chance to prove refinement through suffering. Poorer families, unable to afford proper attire, dyed old clothes black using whatever ink or soot they could find. The result was streaky, smudged garments that smelled faintly of chimney, but at least they demonstrated effort. The rich might have had jet brooches and horse-drawn hearses, but everyone, rich or poor, was expected to perform the theatre of loss. Yet beneath the starch and solemnity, there was something strangely human in this obsession. Mourning gave Victorian structure and chaos. It turned private pain into public ritual, grief into language. When death touched every family, thanks to disease, childbirth, and questionable medical practices, the elaborate etiquette offered comfort through control. Black veils might have hidden tears, but they also shielded people from a world that demanded composure even in heartbreak. Still, the irony lingered. Mourning, meant to express humility, became one of the most visible displays of vanity. People judged each other's grief the way they judged hats or handwriting. "Too soon out of black," whispered the matrons, and far too cheerful at the vicar's tea. So if you ever think modern fashion is excessive, remember the Victorians, who scheduled sadness, colour-coded despair, and made heartbreak look positively chic. Their grief wasn't just felt, it was tailored. Because in the age of lace, virtue, and visibility, even sorrow had to match your outfit. If there was one thing the Victorians loved more than travelling, it was telling everyone how properly they travelled. In an age when steam engines shrank the world and carriages conquered the countryside, the act of movement became yet another opportunity for moral display. To journey anywhere, by rail, road, or even riverboat, was not simply about reaching a destination. It was about maintaining dignity at 30 miles per hour. Victorian travel was 10% sightseeing, 90% pretending you weren't looking at anyone. Before the 19th century, travel was a rugged ordeal. Muddy roads, unpredictable horses, and the ever-present chance of being robbed by someone named Black Jack. But with the arrival of the railway age, suddenly everyone, from dukes to drapers, could move across the country at astonishing speed. The problem was, now you had to do it together. The train carriage became Britain's first social blender, forcing strangers of varying classes into terrifying proximity. Etiquette rushed to fill the gap, publishing pages of advice on how to endure such close quarters without collapsing civilization. The first rule of Victorian travel: be invisible. Speaking to strangers was the social equivalent of licking the window. Passengers were advised to sit upright, maintain neutral expressions, and under no circumstances initiate conversation unless introduced through proper channels, which, on a train, meant never. The polite traveller stared at the window, feigned interest in the countryside, and occasionally adjusted their gloves to signal refinement. Reading was acceptable, but only if your book had no controversial title. Darwin in plain view? Outrageous? Tennyson? Safe? Dickens? Only if you were middle class and wanted everyone to know it. Then came the matter of eye contact, the greatest hazard of railway life. To make it was to imply familiarity. To hold it was practically flirtation. A brief glance could be forgiven as spatial awareness, but anything longer risked reputational implosion. Women, especially, were instructed to keep their gaze modestly lowered, lest their mere curiosity about a passing sheep be mistaken for indecent boldness. Men, meanwhile, had to master the art of staring into middle distance with an air of noble melancholy. Essentially, every Victorian train was filled with people pretending to be in oil paintings. Conversation, if unavoidable, had to be neutral and polite. Acceptable topics included the weather, unseasonably mild, the scenery, very green this year, and occasionally railway timetables, which Victorians treated with religious reverence. Any discussion of politics, money, or illness was scandalous, while humour was downright dangerous. It risked being either vulgar or French. When someone sneezed, the appropriate reaction was silence. Saying bless you to a stranger was shockingly intimate. Personal space was another minefield. In carriages built for 6, elbows were the enemy. Men were to fold hands neatly over walking sticks, women to occupy as little space as their crinolines allowed, which was none. Touching someone accidentally required immediate apology, followed by visible self-loathing. Even sneezing was to be subdued into a muffled cough, preferably into a handkerchief the size of a tablecloth. The ultimate sin? Falling asleep and accidentally leaning on another passenger. Entire friendships were ended over that. Luggage, too, carried social significance. Upper-class travellers had porters and monogrammed trunks large enough to bury their reputations in. Middle-class passengers lugged hat boxes, umbrellas, and the occasional overambitious picnic basket, all carefully labelled with initials, lest their belongings mingle with the wrong class. Poorer travellers, usually servants or workers, carried bundles or baskets, which drew glares from those who believed travel was a privilege, not a necessity. Train compartments, in effect, became microcosms of the British class system, divided, quiet, and filled with mutual disapproval. Etiquette extended to train stations as well. Travellers were expected to arrive early, but not too early. Waiting more than 20 minutes implied poor planning. Standing idly on the platform was unfashionable. One must stroll gracefully, as if timing and composure were inherited traits. Ladies were advised to carry smelling salts for unexpected odours, which, given 19th century locomotives, was most of them. Gentlemen were instructed to assist female travellers with boarding, though only if properly introduced, because even gallantry had boundaries. The rules of carriage travel were equally absurd. Long-distance journeys by private coach demanded elegance under duress. Dust, mud, and discomfort were to be endured silently. Complaining were gauche. A true lady could withstand 12 hours of rattling roads while maintaining the posture of a saint and the facial expression of mild contentment. Conversation with the driver was strictly forbidden, unless, of course, one's horse sneezed, in which case it was acceptable to inquire after its health. Even seaside trips, the Victorian version of a vacation, came with their own moral geography. The journey to the coast was expected to be serene, not joyful. Laughter was permissible only once one had seen the sea, and even then, not too loudly. At resorts, etiquette dictated appropriate promenade behaviour, slow walking, polite nodding, and hats secured firmly against scandalous breezes. Ladies carried parasols, men carried newspapers. Sunburn was a moral failing. And while travel broadened the mind, it also expanded opportunities for judgment. The Victorians, ever fond of categorising people, developed a new skill: assessing strangers in motion. Fellow passengers were scrutinised for accents, attire, and reading material. Was that man in the corner truly a colonel, or merely dressed like one? Did that lady's luggage suggest a widow or a social climber? Every detail became evidence in an unspoken court of etiquette. Of course, behind all this restraint lurked a deep social anxiety. Travel represented modernity, speed, freedom, unpredictability, all the things Victorians secretly feared. Etiquette manuals served as armour against chaos, offering reassurance that civilization could survive even in a railway carriage full of strangers. Rules for behaviour were less about courtesy and more about control. If you could regulate your posture, perhaps you could regulate the world. Still, there were rebels, those who dared to talk, laugh, or even snack en route. Their boldness made them legends of inconvenience. Newspapers occasionally published letters from outraged passengers describing barbarians who ate sandwiches in the same compartment or, brace yourself, discussed their personal lives out loud. These tales served as cautionary parables, warning readers of the dangers of unchecked humanity. By journey's end, every traveller was relieved to disembark, not just because they'd arrived, but because they could finally exhale. Stepping off the train meant escaping the unspoken contract of mutual invisibility. Once again, you could cough freely, stretch your legs, or even smile without consequence. So next time you find yourself on a train, earbuds in, avoiding eye contact with everyone, you're not being antisocial, you're being exquisitely Victorian. Because in their world, as in ours, travel wasn't about connection, it was about endurance. And while the carriages have changed, the ritual remains: sit straight, look away, and pretend you're just admiring the view. In the Victorian world, communication travelled not by Wi-Fi, but by willpower, wax, and moral judgment. The letter was far more than a message. It was a mirror of your soul, your class, and your education. Every word, loop of ink, and choice of stationery revealed who you were, and more dangerously, who you were pretending to be. Emails today have best regards. Victorians had 12 paragraphs of subtle insults wrapped in politeness. The art of letter writing was considered a cornerstone of civilization. Good handwriting meant good breeding. Careless ink suggested a careless heart. Stationery was never neutral. It announced your identity before you even wrote "Dear." The wealthy used thick cream paper engraved with family crests, while the aspiring middle classes invested in embossed initials, hoping to look hereditary. Poorer writers used plain sheets but compensated with florid language and excessive underlining. Your penmanship was your handshake, and heaven help you if it trembled. Let's begin with the salutation, a minefield of meaning. My dear sir was businesslike. Dear sir was distant. My dearest friend hinted at genuine affection, while respected madam might as well have been written with tongs. Addressing someone incorrectly could end friendships, negotiations, or inheritances. Even punctuation mattered. The comma after dear was intimate. The colon was cold. Victorians could read entire emotional histories between punctuation marks. Love affairs doomed by semicolons. The opening paragraph was not about content but courtesy. Victorians began with lengthy inquiries into health, weather, and family, regardless of urgency. I trust this finds you in good health and spirits was the universal preface, whether you were writing to your mother or your mortal enemy. Only after these formal pleasantries could one cautiously approach the point, unless, of course, the letter was to convey bad news, in which case one circled it for several paragraphs, gently preparing the reader for emotional impact. "It grieves me to inform you," was the polite herald of disaster. For friendly letters, tone was everything. The writer must appear warm but never over-eager, witty but not immodest. True intimacy was expressed through careful restraint. "You're ever in my thoughts" was safe. "I think of you daily" bordered on melodrama. Correspondence between close friends often developed its own rhythm, exchanging poetry, gossip, and moral reflections. But even here, caution ruled. Too much humour and you risked being frivolous. Too much honesty and you risked being modern. When writing to strangers, etiquette demanded humility so elaborate it bordered on apology. Requests began with acrobatics of politeness. "May I presume upon your kindness to trouble you with a small inquiry?" By the time you reached the actual question, the reader was half asleep and wholly disarmed. Victorians wielded politeness like a tranquilizer dart. Business letters followed a strict moral geometry. Brevity was admired, but rudeness unforgivable. The phrase "yours obediently" concluded most professional correspondence, implying both respect and mild servitude. Insults were encoded in passive syntax. "I fear there must be some misunderstanding regarding your last invoice," translated neatly to "you're wrong and possibly illiterate." Social letters, those written to acquaintances or distant relatives, were the most treacherous. These required the delicate balance of sounding interested without actually being interested. "It was delightful to hear of your recent engagement" could mean genuine happiness, or barely suppressed outrage. Every sentence doubled as camouflage. Victorians didn't gossip about people. They gossiped to them, disguised as compliments. Then came the matter of letters to enemies, which Victorians excelled at. The true mark of refinement was the ability to annihilate someone without ever raising one's voice. "I was surprised to learn of your opinion, which differs from mine in such an interesting way," was pure social artillery. Apologies, when issued, were crafted like treaties. "Should any expression of mine have unintentionally caused you discomfort, I regret the misapprehension." Translation: "You're still wrong, but I'm civilized enough to regret it politely." Of course, letters had to look as elegant as they sounded. Ink stains were catastrophic, visual proof of inner disorder. Smudging away suggested moral instability. Fold lines had to be crisp, wax seals unblemished. The colour of sealing wax mattered too. Red for business, black for mourning, blue for friendship, green for hope, and gold if you were feeling dramatically self-important. Poor sealing technique could result in social embarrassment or worse, a letter that opened in transit. There was no tragedy like your confidential musing about Lady Pembroke's wig arriving unsealed on her doorstep. And then there were thank you letters, the backbone of Victorian diplomacy. After every visit, dinner, or minor act of kindness, one was expected to produce a handwritten note within 24 hours. "Your charming hospitality will long remain in my memory," translated roughly to "your food was edible, and I am now free of obligation." Failure to write back was tantamount to spitting on the welcome mat. For the ambitious, there existed the art of the indirect insult, a refined blood sport conducted through ink. Polite society loved nothing more than hostility hidden behind calligraphy. Phrases like, "I shall not detain you longer from your numerous engagements," or "I trust you will forgive the brevity of this note," were weapons sharper than sabres. The entire culture thrived on saying terrible things beautifully. The closing of a letter was an emotional thermometer. Yours truly was cool professionalism. Yours sincerely implied respect. Yours affectionately meant warmth, while yours ever was dangerously intimate. For spurned lovers, yours faithfully carried just enough frost to freeze an engagement. Victorians didn't slam doors, they folded paper and sealed them shut. Once finished, the letter embarked on its journey through the postal system, the beating heart of Victorian communication. With up to 12 deliveries a day in London alone, lovers and litigants alike could send multiple emotional updates before lunch. The postman became an unlikely arbiter of human drama, carrying both joy and ruin in his satchel. Few sounds thrilled the Victorian ear like a knock at the door and the words, "A letter for you, madam." In the end, correspondence wasn't just communication, it was performance. Letters preserved dignity, diffused tension, and disguised emotion under 1,000 layers of ink. They were miniature essays on how to feel without appearing to. Every flourish of the pen balanced on the razor's edge between sincerity and scandal. So next time you dash off an email with kind regards, take a moment to imagine your Victorian counterpart hunched over a desk, quill trembling, pouring their soul into parchment while ensuring every loop of their Y conveyed restraint. They wrote not to express, but to impress, because in their world, the true sin wasn't saying too much, it was saying anything inelegantly. In Victorian society, conversation wasn't communication, it was choreography. Words were not used to exchange ideas, but to navigate the minefield of civility without detonating one's reputation. Every drawing room, dinner party, and garden stroll was an Olympic event in verbal restraint. To speak was to risk judgment, and to stay silent was to invite suspicion. The goal was not to be interesting, but to be inoffensive. If you accidentally had an opinion, apologize immediately. The first rule of polite conversation: no strong feelings. Emotion was vulgar, and conviction was contagious, both unacceptable. Politics, religion, and personal beliefs were strictly forbidden in mixed company. Nothing could end a soirée faster than mentioning the Prime Minister or, heaven forbid, theology. These topics were considered conversational dynamite, capable of turning a tranquil tea into a public execution. Even mild agreement was dangerous. Enthusiasm was practically rebellion. Instead, Victorians specialised in what they called elevated triviality. Acceptable subjects included weather, quite mild for November, literature, Dickens, yes, though a touch sentimental, or travel. The air in Bath is said to improve the complexion. One might safely discuss flowers, pets, or the virtues of punctuality. The weather in particular was the social glue of the empire, endlessly renewable and politically neutral. You could spend an entire afternoon murmuring about barometric pressure and emerge with your dignity intact. There were, of course, different conversational codes for different rooms. In the drawing room, talk was gentle and ornamental, designed to show breeding rather than intellect. Men saved their deeper opinions for clubs and smoking rooms, where they could grumble about politics without frightening the furniture. At afternoon tea, women engaged in what etiquette books called pleasant interchange, which translated roughly to compliments disguised as gossip. You didn't say, "Lady Weston is scandalous." You said, "Lady Weston always dresses so confidently." Interruptions were a capital offence. Conversation was a waltz, not a brawl. One was to wait for natural pauses before speaking, ideally contributing a comment of modest wit and no consequence. Speaking too long was boastful, too short, ungracious. The perfect remark lasted precisely the length of a polite smile, and the delivery, that was an art form. A Victorian voice had to be melodic but subdued, the kind of tone that could lull small birds to sleep. Women were advised to keep their speech low and silver, never shrill or hurried. Men were encouraged to project authority but never volume. Loudness was associated with sailors, salesmen and Americans, all equally alarming. Flattery was the lubricant of conversation, but it had to be subtle enough to pass as observation. "You are looking remarkably well" was safe. "You look lovely today" was far too forward. Compliments to women's intelligence were tricky, since intelligence was considered both admirable and inconvenient. The phrase, "a woman of conversation," was high praise, meaning she could talk gracefully for 20 minutes without revealing a single original thought. Silence, too, was weaponized. Strategic pauses suggested refinement, as if one's mind were weighing diamonds of thought. Too much silence, however, invited awkwardness, the greatest social sin of all. A host's nightmare was a dinner table so quiet that the clinking of silverware began to sound like doom. Etiquette manuals advise rescuing dead air with gentle inquiries. Questions about gardens, books, or the latest charity events. Asking about someone's health was safe. Asking about their doctor was intrusive, and heaven help you if you laughed too loudly. Laughter was to be managed like perfume, light, fleeting, and never overpowering. A giggle was charming. A guffaw was practically animalistic. Ladies were advised to cover their mouths while laughing, lest mirth undermine modesty. Men could smile, perhaps even chuckle, but outright hilarity belonged to the lower orders. A well-bred person's sense of humour was not visible to the naked eye. The art of listening was equally crucial. To listen well was to look as though you found everything fascinating while preparing your next remark. One must nod thoughtfully, murmur "indeed," and occasionally emit a soft "how very interesting," even if one had stopped listening 5 minutes ago. The greatest conversationalists were those who could survive an entire evening without contributing anything memorable. When conversation turned dangerous, perhaps drifting toward forbidden topics like wages, science, or, shudder, personal happiness, the skilled Victorian knew how to pivot. The classic escape routes were praise for the hostess, admiration of the furniture, or sudden fascination with the nearest piece of porcelain. "Ah, what a charming vase," was code for "we are approaching social meltdown." For all their rigidity, Victorians viewed conversation as the purest test of breeding. It wasn't about what you said, but how you said it. Wit was admired, but only if it came with restraint. The goal was to sparkle without dazzling, to amuse without offending, and to sound intelligent without suggesting you'd ever read anything controversial. Those who failed were branded as bores, eccentrics, or worse, radicals. Children and servants naturally were forbidden from speaking unless spoken to, which made most Victorian households sound like theatrical monologues performed before live audiences of terrified spectators. At large dinners, the seating chart itself dictated conversation. A gentleman was expected to speak first to the lady on his right, then politely transition to the one on his left. If he ran out of things to say, etiquette manuals recommended a well-timed compliment on the wine or the weather in that order. Of course, not everyone obeyed. Some notorious figures, artists, journalists and Americans, broke the conversational code, daring to express feelings. They shocked the drawing rooms of London by discussing things like art, politics, and existence itself. These radicals were often admired from a safe distance, much like exotic animals, fascinating to observe, best not imitated. Yet beneath the repression lay a curious truth. All this careful restraint gave conversation a strange beauty. Each phrase was a polished gemstone, each pause deliberate. The Victorians built dialogue into architecture, precise, elegant, and slightly terrifying. You might leave a party having learned nothing, but at least no one left offended. So the next time you find yourself awkwardly chatting about the weather, take heart. You're participating in a grand Victorian tradition, the noble art of saying absolutely nothing while sounding magnificent. And should you accidentally reveal an opinion, do the proper thing. Blush, sip your tea, and apologise immediately for your lapse in civilization. In Victorian society, friendship wasn't measured in affection, it was measured in visits. The drawing room wasn't merely a place to relax. It was a social battleground where reputations rose and fell based on punctual appearances and properly folded calling cards. Visiting etiquette was the calendar-shaped minefield every respectable person had to cross to survive. Forget emotional closeness. If you missed someone's Tuesday, you might as well move to another continent. Visiting wasn't just about popping in for a chat. It was a formal ritual, a carefully timed performance of civility that combined diplomacy, scheduling, and espionage. You couldn't simply decide to see someone because you liked them. Visits were governed by invisible timetables known only to those fluent in the language of social hierarchy. A proper Victorian knew precisely when to call on acquaintances, how long to stay, and which tier of society they occupied, all while maintaining the expression of someone just delighted to be there. Let's start with the at-home day, the cornerstone of the visiting system. Every respectable lady designated one afternoon a week to receive callers, usually indicated on her engraved visiting card, Tuesdays 3 to 6. That small line of print controlled an entire city's movements. On Tuesdays, you might find half of London trotting from drawing room to drawing room, carriages clogging the streets like polite traffic jams of lace and top hats. To arrive on the wrong day was catastrophic, a social faux pas akin to showing up at someone's wedding wearing pyjamas. Visits fell into categories as nuanced as the British class system itself. Morning calls, which confusingly occurred in the afternoon, were short. Formal affairs. About 15 minutes long, the precise duration needed to appear gracious without suggesting attachment. A clock watcher's paradise, these visits demanded perfect timing. Arrive too early and you'd interrupt lunch. Too late and you would appear desperate for company. Stay longer than the allotted quarter hour and your hostess might begin to exhibit polite symptoms of social suffocation. First calls were the most nerve-wracking. The Victorian equivalent of sending a friend request. When moving to a new neighbourhood, families sent out calling cards as introductions, praying that someone would return the call, thus acknowledging their social existence. Failure to respond was a genteel form of exile. You might as well have been a ghost haunting your own street. The exchange of calling cards was the bloodstream of social life. Each card carried meaning beyond its ink. Folded corners, initials, and even smudge marks conveyed hidden messages. A turned-down corner meant the card was delivered in person, an unmarked one by servant. A small penciled note could hint at condolences, congratulations, or romantic intent. Society functioned like an elaborate postal service where the post was gossip and the stamps were lace gloves. Arriving for a visit involved more choreography than a ballet. Upon entering the hall, one handed their card to the servant, who would decide whether the hostess was at home. This was not a question of geography but of diplomacy. Not at home didn't necessarily mean she was absent, only that she was unavailable to you. One could be at home to the Duchess of Wexford, yet not at home to Mrs. Pembroke down the street. It was social camouflage disguised as politeness, and everyone knew it. If you passed inspection and were admitted, your real trial began. The drawing room was a testing ground for manners. Conversation had to sparkle within safe limits, no politics, no gossip too pointed, and certainly no mention of illness. Guests were expected to sit upright on the edge of the sofa, sip tea gracefully, and depart at the exact moment before their presence turned from charming to clingy. The hostess, meanwhile, had to balance conversation, refreshments, and the delicate task of signalling when it was time for you to go. Subtle cues, such as setting down her teacup or glancing at the clock, were polite code for your carriage awaits, whether you own one or not. Returning visits was the backbone of social respectability. If someone called on you, etiquette demanded you return the favour within a week or two. Failure to reciprocate suggested arrogance or indifference. Relationships could crumble over unreturned visits, their remains discussed in whispers over tea. Mrs. Lennox never returned my January call, someone might say, tone heavy with moral disappointment. The room would sigh as though she had committed treason. Then there were mourning visits, a paradox of sorrow and scheduling. These required careful balance. One must appear sympathetic but not intrusive, sombre but not melodramatic. A brief note of condolence followed by a short quiet call was expected, but only after a suitable interval. Arriving too soon after a death was seen as opportunistic. Arriving too late suggested callousness. Victorian empathy had the office hours. Social ambition turned visiting into an art of calculated endurance. The higher one's aspirations, the more visits required. Women of means spent entire afternoons calling, their carriages rattling between neighbourhoods in pursuit of social traction. It was exhausting, expensive, and utterly necessary. Servants were instructed to polish boots, prepare flowers, and ensure the calling cards never ran out. A lady's reputation wasn't built at dinner parties. It was built in 15-minute increments of polite exhaustion. Even absences carried danger. Missing someone's at-home day too many times implied either carelessness or contempt. "I fear we have lost the Pembrokes," one might murmur regretfully, as if the Pembrokes had died of social neglect. To restore relations required a written apology, an explanation, the weather, a prior engagement, or illness in the household, and sometimes a peace offering, like an invitation to your own tea where you could resume the cycle anew. Yet beneath the absurdity, the visiting ritual held real purpose. In a world without phones or emails, this was how people sustained relationships, through presence, performance, and punctuality. It allowed the Victorians to transform loneliness into routine and competition into civility. Every handshake, smile, and teacup reinforced the delicate machinery of social life, keeping the empire's vast network of acquaintances humming like a well-oiled clock. So this next time you forget to reply to a text for a week, be grateful you don't live in an age where forgetting someone's Tuesday could doom your social lineage. For the Victorians, friendship wasn't spontaneous. It was scheduled, punctual, and monitored by servants with better memories than most politicians. Theirs was a world where civility was sacred, time was currency, and a missed visit could cost you everything, except, of course, your composure. If you ever needed proof that the Victorians treated hierarchy like a sacred sport, just observe how they spoke to one another. Every sentence was a mirror reflecting social position. The rules of etiquette didn't just apply to what you said, they depended entirely on who you said it to. In other words, your manners came with a menu. The upper classes got one version, the middle classes another, and servants, well, they mostly got ignored. If the Queen sneezed, you said "bless you." If a servant sneezed, you pretended sound didn't exist. Victorian society wasn't built on equality, it was built on awareness. Everyone knew their place, and etiquette ensured they stayed there. From drawing rooms to dinner tables, the entire social world ran on a delicate choreography of rank recognition. You could tell who someone was, how much they earned, and what kind of coal they burned at home simply by how they greeted others. Let's begin at the top of the pyramid. Royalty and aristocracy, the demigods of decorum. Speaking to someone with a title required linguistic gymnastics. The Queen was addressed as Your Majesty on the first mention, ma'am, thereafter. Lords and ladies each had their own verbal dance steps. A duke was Your Grace, a baronet Sir, and heaven help the foreign visitor who confused a marquis with a viscount. The latter would likely faint from social injury. Bowing and curtsying weren't optional niceties. They were compulsory acts of submission, each with its proper depth and timing. Too shallow, and you appeared insolent. Too deep, and you looked like you were auditioning for the carpet. Moving down a notch, the upper classes of the landed gentry and titled families maintained their own etiquette ecosystems. Here, manners functioned as currency. You didn't just speak politely, you spoke in ways that reassured everyone of your breeding. Vocabulary was curated, accents polished, and sentences arranged with the precision of floral displays. Vulgar slang was an instant disqualifier from polite company. It wasn't that the upper classes didn't use slang, they just invented their own, safely disguised as euphemism. When a duchess said someone was a bit trying, she meant they were one conversation away from social banishment. The middle classes, meanwhile, were trapped in an eternal performance of imitation. They studied etiquette manuals the way theologians studied scripture, memorizing when to bow, when to nod, and how to hold a teacup without looking nouveau riche. Their greatest fear was giving themselves away, revealing through some tiny misstep, like buttering bread incorrectly, that they hadn't been born to the lifestyle they were now aggressively rehearsing. Their speech was careful, their manners desperate, their lives one long audition for upper-class acceptance. And then there were the working classes, for whom etiquette existed mostly as a list of rules they were expected to follow but never benefit from. Servants, in particular, were expected to master the codes of their employer's world without ever using them as equals. A butler addressed his employer as Sir, and his employer's guests as my lord or my lady, yet he himself was to be addressed only by surname, Stevens, Higgins, or Cook. First names were for inferiors, and servants were rarely granted that intimacy. If you were a maid and someone said your name aloud in front of guests, you'd probably assume you were being dismissed. Within the servant hierarchy itself, rank still ruled. The butler reigned supreme below stairs, followed by the housekeeper, then the lady's maid, the valet, and the army of maids, footmen, and scullery workers beneath them. Each rank spoke to the next with calibrated deference. A kitchen maid didn't speak to the butler. She spoke around him, ideally through intermediaries or respectful silence. Every yes sir and no ma'am wasn't just politeness, it was survival. Even eye contact obeyed the ladder of rank. Looking directly at one's social superior was daring. Holding their gaze was mutiny. Servants learned to look through their employers, appearing attentive but never equal. A servant could spend decades in a household, know every secret, and yet remain as socially invisible as the wallpaper. Meanwhile, the lady of the house might discuss weather patterns with a duchess for half an hour, while pretending not to notice the maid pouring her tea. The Victorians also perfected the art of selective politeness. A gentleman might doff his hat to a passing lady of breeding, but march straight past a washerwoman as though gravity didn't apply to her. In carriages, gentlemen tipped their hats to equals. In cabs, they tipped their hats to no one. Manners, in short, were a status performance, not kindness, but choreography. And nowhere was this more apparent than at dinner. The seating plan itself resembled a social topography. The host and hostess occupied the poles of prestige, flanked by the highest-ranking guests. The closer you sat to the host, the higher your standing. Conversation followed suit. The upper-class guests discussed opera. The middle-class ones politely pretended to know what an aria was, and the servants circulating behind them maintained a respectful silence, unless addressed, which was rare. Even letters obeyed the hierarchy. A peer could write freely to a tradesman, but a tradesman writing to a peer had to bury himself in apologies first. I humbly beg your lordship's pardon for troubling you with so minor a matter. The hierarchy even extended to signatures. Aristocrats often signed simply with their surname, Cavendish or Pembroke, because anyone worth writing to already knew who they were. The middle classes, desperate for clarity, included every initial they owned. Of course, hypocrisy was the true genius of the system. Everyone pretended etiquette was about civility, but it was really about containment. By regulating behaviour, the Victorians made sure nobody forgot their place. Etiquette served as velvet barbed wire, soft to the touch but impossible to climb. A polite world was a controlled world, and the entire structure depended on constant performance. Yet there was a perverse beauty to it all. For the Victorians, hierarchy wasn't just tolerated, it was sacred, the scaffolding that held civilization together. Even as industrialization blurred class lines, manners reinforced them. A newly rich merchant might buy a manor house, but if he offered to shake a duke's hand uninvited, all the marble fireplaces in England couldn't save him. So yes, the Victorians worshipped etiquette, but only when it bent to rank. Every bow, curtsy and greeting was a ritual reaffirming who mattered and who didn't. The Queen sneezed, and the world blessed her. A servant sneezed, and the world adjusted its monocle. politely pretending sound itself had never been invented. If the Victorian era had an official national sport, it wasn't cricket or croquet, it was gossip. Whispered, written, or published in scandal sheets, rumour was the invisible engine that kept society humming and reputations trembling. Respectability was the empire's most fragile currency, and one careless remark could bankrupt it overnight. Victorian gossip spread faster than measles and ruined more lives. The Victorians lived in a world where appearances weren't just everything, they were the only thing. Politeness was the public mask, gossip the private hobby. The two worked in perfect symbiosis. You smiled at someone in person, then dissected them over tea. Even the most upright citizens participated. The more moral someone appeared, the sharper their appetite for hearsay. Because when your society depends entirely on keeping up appearances, gossip becomes not just entertainment, it becomes surveillance. Rumour in the 19th century had tiers of respectability. At the bottom were street whispers and servant chatter, raw, unrefined, often alarmingly accurate. Above that floated polite drawing room gossip, a genteel version filtered through lace and euphemism. By the time it reached print in society columns, scandal had been thoroughly perfumed and made fit for public consumption. The result was a culture where everyone pretended to be shocked by the very rumours they had spent the previous week enthusiastically spreading. Reputation was social oxygen. Without it, you suffocated. A lady's virtue, a gentleman's honour, a family's name all depended on the absence of whispers. Even the vaguest hint of impropriety could destroy years of careful image cultivation. A married woman caught talking to a man too long at a ball risked being labelled fast, a word that meant both too lively and forever finished. A bachelor with unpaid debts might find himself quietly uninvited from dinner parties. The most powerful weapon in Victorian society wasn't a sword or pistol, it was the raised eyebrow. The machinery of gossip was astonishingly efficient. Servants acted as the era's unofficial reporters, their daily proximity to family secrets making them the unsung authors of half the social news in London. Footmen observed flirtations in hallways, maids overheard arguments through doors, cooks exchanged stories with delivery boys. Information trickled upward faster than champagne down a pyramid. Respectable families might pretend to despise gossip, but they relied on it to stay informed, especially about whom to avoid. Then came the newspapers, the Victorian internet, which democratised rumour with terrifying precision. Publications like the Morning Post, the Times, and the Illustrated Police News turned private affairs into public spectacles. Scandals that once circulated discreetly among tea tables now spread to breakfast tables across the empire. A titled lady's elopement or a lord's gambling debt could headline next to dispatches from India. To be mentioned in print, especially in italics, was both thrilling and horrifying. One columnist's careless phrase could end a social career. Even literature contributed to the swirl. Novelists like Thackeray and Trollope based entire plots on gossip's destructive power, turning whispers into moral lessons. But for every fictional fall from grace, there were dozens of real ones. The notorious divorce trials of the 1850s, particularly those involving the aristocracy, became Victorian reality shows. Courtrooms were packed with spectators eager to hear who had run off with whose footman, their moral outrage generously laced with fascination. But gossip wasn't just a weapon. It was a currency of belonging. To be included in gossip meant you were relevant. If no one whispered about you, you might as well be invisible. Society thrived on rumour as proof of vitality. The trick was to be gossiped about just enough. Too much and you were scandalous, none at all and you were dull. A lady who could attract speculation while maintaining plausible innocence had mastered the true art of social survival. Euphemism was the dialect of gossip. Direct accusation was vulgar, suggestion was art. No one said affair, they said an unfortunate attachment. A woman wasn't ruined, she was indisposed socially. A man wasn't drunk at the opera, he was overcome by enthusiasm for Verdi. The language of scandal was a constant balancing act between moral condemnation and entertainment value. The goal was to sound shocked, while ensuring everyone heard the details twice. Social hostesses were the great conductors of this symphony. Their salons and teas were where reputations were made, tested, and occasionally executed. A skilled hostess could steer gossip like a ship's captain in stormy waters, never starting rumours herself, perish the thought, but allowing them to blossom conveniently among her guests. She was both judge and jester, able to deliver character assassinations under the guise of concern. "I do worry about dear Mrs. Talbot," she might sigh. "She seems so resilient for a woman so often disappointed." Translation: Mrs. Talbot's latest scandal is delicious, and I know every detail. For men, gossip was no less treacherous. A gentleman's reputation rested on honour and restraint. Gambling debts, political improprieties, or excessive drinking could circulate in the club corridors of Pall Mall within hours. The upper-class male solution was to ignore everything. Stoicism was the ultimate defence. If one does not acknowledge rumour, one etiquette guide advised, it ceases to exist. It didn't, of course. It simply migrated to someone else's dinner table. Women, however, faced the true cruelty of the gossip economy. A single whisper could erase them from polite society. A woman accused of flirtation or unfeminine independence might find herself quietly uninvited from gatherings. Divorced women were social lepers. Widows, if too cheerful, were suspected of moral flexibility. The double standard was merciless. Men were dashing, women were doubtful. In the Victorian theatre of virtue, one blush could be a death sentence. And yet, for all its venom, gossip gave the Victorians a kind of coherence. It kept the gears of civility turning, ensuring that everyone policed themselves to avoid scandal. Gossip was their moral Wi-Fi, invisible, omnipresent, and impossible to disconnect from. It united drawing rooms and slums in a shared addiction to speculation. Even Queen Victoria herself wasn't immune. Her court was a hotbed of rumour, her diaries brimming with cryptic complaints about the behaviour of certain persons. So when you imagine the Victorians as prim and silent, think again. They were a civilization of chatter, refined, relentless, and gloriously hypocritical. Their whispers could elevate or obliterate, sanctify or scandalise. Every sigh and side glance was part of the great orchestra of judgment that played daily across Britain. In the end, gossip wasn't just a pastime, it was power disguised as conversation. And in a world where a raised eyebrow could end a life's ambition, the only truly safe thing to say was nothing at all. Though of course someone would still find that suspicious. In the Victorian world, etiquette was supposed to keep chaos at bay, a social armour polished to perfection. But for every rule designed to maintain order, there were 3 more waiting to trip someone up. The truth was, no one, not even the most practised duchess or marble-faced gentleman, could keep track of them all. And when the rules collided, disaster followed. One misplaced napkin, and suddenly your history's cautionary tale. Victorian etiquette wasn't a single code but a labyrinth of contradictions. Manuals of manners poured from printing presses faster than scandal sheets. There were books on how to eat, sit, breathe, bow, and exist without offending anyone within a 20-foot radius. But the problem was, no 2 of them agreed. One said you must enter a room ahead of your husband, another swore it was unforgivably forward. Some demanded women lower their eyes when speaking, others insisted eye contact showed confidence. It was less a guide to good behaviour and more a social booby trap disguised in calligraphy. And naturally, there were victims, people who broke the invisible code not out of malice, but by the simple act of existing in the wrong way before the wrong audience. Let's start with one of the most famous etiquette casualties of the 19th century, Lady Flora Hastings. In 1839, Lady Flora, a lady-in-waiting to Queen Victoria's mother, began showing signs of illness and a swelling in her abdomen. The court, ever quick to judge, concluded she must be pregnant. Queen Victoria herself, barely 20 and already allergic to scandal, believed the gossip and treated Lady Flora with public frost. Physicians were summoned, whispers multiplied, and before the poor woman could even defend herself, she was branded morally corrupt. The truth? She wasn't pregnant. She had a terminal tumour. When she died months later, society learned its lesson about the perils of gossip and hasty judgment. Briefly, then they went back to doing it. But etiquette blunders weren't confined to tragedy. Some were downright comic, at least for everyone except the victim. Take the Countess of Cardigan, who committed the ultimate sin at a royal dinner. She used the wrong fork. One misplaced utensil was all it took to trigger a fury of raised eyebrows and whispers across the table. Her error, though minor, was immortalised in gossip columns for weeks. It was said she fled the capital shortly after, not out of shame, but simply because she'd had enough of people staring at her cutlery. Then there was Edward, Prince of Wales, later King Edward VII, a man both born to rule and doomed to break decorum. During his youth, his casual friendliness scandalised the court. He greeted people too warmly, danced too freely, and was once seen laughing in church, a sin that made headlines. When he dared to place a hand on a woman's back during a waltz, society practically fainted in unison. "Too familiar," cried the newspapers, as though he'd proposed indecency with a glance. Ironically, decades later, he would be celebrated for humanising royalty. But in his time, he was the man who turned good evening into a moral crisis. Even great thinkers weren't immune. Charles Darwin, while revolutionising science, made an unintentional faux pas at a dinner hosted by the scientific elite. When his hostess asked, "What do you think of our little gathering?" he replied honestly, "Quite lively, rather like a species adapting to its surroundings." His joke fell flatter than a pressed fern. The ladies gasped. The gentlemen cleared their throats. Darwin learned the hard way that humour and social Darwinism did not mix well at dessert. The Victorians' obsession with propriety extended even to grief, and not always gracefully. The American-born socialite Jenny Jerome, later Lady Randolph Churchill, yes, Winston's mother, once committed the unthinkable. She attended a soirée only weeks after a relative's funeral, wearing a gown that shimmered too brightly. Though she argued it was deep navy, not black, society's response was swift and merciless. "Shameless in satin," read one newspaper headline. Apparently, mourning etiquette required more penitence than the Ten Commandments, but perhaps the crown jewel of etiquette blunders belongs to Lord Byron's daughter, Ada Lovelace, mathematician, genius, and pioneer of computer theory before computers existed. At a London salon, she interrupted a pompous gentleman who was explaining a mathematical concept incorrectly. Ada, with impeccable logic, corrected him. The problem, she did it publicly and she was a woman. The man's pride imploded on the spot, and gossip spread that Ada was unladylike and too clever by half. Her crime wasn't rudeness, it was accuracy. Then there were the accidental scandals, moments when sheer bad luck collided with social paranoia. One poor governess, recorded in an 1864 etiquette column, slipped on a rug and accidentally fell into a bowing position before her employer's guest. The man, assuming she was mocking him, lodged a complaint, and the governess was dismissed. Etiquette had no mercy for accidents. If something looked improper, it was improper. Even clothing could betray you. In 1888, a lady in Brighton was ejected from a seaside hotel for wearing a dress that revealed, brace yourself, her ankles. It wasn't indecent by design. Her hem had torn on the stairs, but the damage was done. The other guests reportedly looked away as though she'd just shouted obscenities in Greek. Her reputation followed the hemline straight out the door. Public figures faced the constant threat of etiquette ambush. Prime Minister William Gladstone, known for his moral fervour, once shocked dinner guests by buttering an entire slice of bread instead of spreading it piece by piece. "Such indulgence," hissed one duchess, as if he'd buttered the Ten Commandments themselves. That incident was gleefully repeated for years by political enemies who found nothing funnier than a fallen saint with greasy fingers. What made these moments so potent wasn't just the mistake, it was the aftermath. Victorians didn't forgive quickly. Once your name was linked to an etiquette lapse, it became part of your biography. You could build hospitals, write novels, or colonise half the world, and someone at dinner would still whisper, "Didn't he once sneeze during grace?" The irony, of course, was that the very system designed to uphold civility guaranteed humiliation. The rules were so many, so contradictory, that breaking them was inevitable. The trick wasn't perfection, it was recovery. A skilled hostess could turn disaster into charm with a well-timed laugh or a witty deflection. But for most, one slip meant social purgatory, where people still bowed to you but spoke of you only in the past tense. So if you ever spill wine at dinner, trip in front of a boss, or wave at someone who wasn't waving at you, take comfort. The Victorians would have done the same, only in silk gloves under chandeliers, and with a gossip columnist taking notes. For them, etiquette wasn't just a code of manners, it was a game of survival. And every now and then someone lost spectacularly. The Victorians may be long gone, their corsets unfastened, their calling cards yellowed with age, but their ghost still lingers in our daily interactions. Every polite, "excuse me," every nervous smile in an elevator, every moment you hold a door open for someone 15 feet away because you started too early, that's Victorian etiquette whispering from the grave. We may not bow or curtsy anymore, but we still panic when someone waves and we don't know if it's at us. The Victorians didn't invent politeness, but they industrialized it. They took centuries of scattered customs, medieval chivalry, Georgian civility and Regency charm, and wrapped them in rules dense enough to power an empire. For them, manners were moral armor, proof that even in an age of factories, fog, and questionable plumbing, humanity could still behave. Etiquette was civilization's signature perfume designed to mask the stench of rapid social change. But when the Victorian world eventually loosened its stays, its manners didn't vanish, they evolved. Many of the social niceties we treat as instinctive today are, in fact, hand-me-downs from that anxious, overdressed century. Take the modern handshake, for instance. While earlier eras used bows or curtsies to demonstrate respect, Victorians popularised the handshake as a symbol of sincerity and equality, at least between men. It spread with the same enthusiasm as their railways, eventually replacing most formal greetings. Today we might fist bump or awkwardly wave, but the principle remains: physical gestures as social contracts. The concept of personal space too owes a great deal to the Victorians. Their obsession with modesty created invisible bubbles of propriety, emotional quarantine zones that persist in our modern fear of standing too close to strangers. Public composure was everything. A Victorian would rather faint elegantly than display raw emotion in the street, and while we no longer carry smelling salts, we still share their instinct for suppressing chaos. You can thank the Victorians every time you resist screaming during small talk with a co-worker. Even the simple idea of good manners as moral virtue is a Victorian relic. Before them, etiquette had been mostly about aristocratic style, how to impress peers and confuse peasants. The Victorians democratized it. Suddenly manners weren't just for the titled, they were for anyone climbing the social ladder. Politeness became proof of decency, a way for the middle classes to advertise respectability without needing blue blood or large estates. If you couldn't be noble by birth, you could at least be noble in conversation, preferably over tea. They also gave us the modern plague known as polite awkwardness. Victorians mastered the art of concealing discomfort under layers of civility, and we're still paying the price. Their spirit lives on in every forced laugh, every "let's catch up" that both parties know will never happen. We no longer live in a world of calling cards and rigid visiting hours, yet we've inherited the same emotional choreography. Appear pleasant, conceal panic, and smile as though your social survival depends on it, because in their world it did. The Victorians also left behind their obsession with appearances, though now it's filtered through social media rather than social season. They curated reputation through portraits, guest lists, and carefully edited gossip. We do it through profile pictures, hashtags, and casual photos that took 4 attempts. The technology has changed, but the impulse remains identical. The desperate need to appear composed, charming, and ever so slightly better than everyone else. Even our language of politeness owes them a debt. Pardon me, would you mind, and if it's not too much trouble, all carry the same DNA as Victorian deference, linguistic fencing designed to keep conflict at bay. They would never say move when would you be so kind as to allow me to pass could delay disaster. We've trimmed the excess, but the skeleton is still there, indirectness as kindness. Meanwhile, their class anxieties evolved into our professional etiquette. The modern office, with its dress codes, hierarchies, and obsession with tone, is a Victorian drawing room in disguise. Corporate manners are just industrial age politeness with better fonts. The Victorians believed that self-control proved worthiness. We now call it professionalism. A 19th century clerk avoided political discussion at dinner. A 21st century worker avoids it on Slack. Both fear the same outcome: social death via impropriety. Even our ideas about public behaviour still echo theirs. Victorians valued composure, and that legacy endures every time you suppress a sneeze on public transport, whisper apologies to a stranger you'll never see again, or instinctively queue without question. The queue, by the way, was one of Britain's proudest Victorian exports, the civilised alternative to mob behaviour. A true Victorian would rather die in line than cut it. And while their system of rank has faded, their shadow persists in subtle ways. We no longer curtsy to duchesses, but we still adjust our tone depending on who we're speaking to. The boss, the waiter, the in-laws. The Victorians invented the social thermostat, teaching us how to modulate warmth and distance like trained diplomats. A middle-class family in 1880 worried about addressing a marquis correctly. We panic about using too many exclamation marks in work emails. Progress of a sort. But perhaps the greatest Victorian legacy is the paradox they left behind. The belief that politeness is both genuine and performative. They lived in an age where being civilised meant mastering the art of pretending, of hiding emotion, improvising sincerity, and packaging morality in perfect grammar. We've inherited that mask, even as we roll our eyes at it. Behind every modern "no worries" or "all good" lies the same reflex to appear calm, composed, and decent, no matter the inner turmoil. And yet, we shouldn't dismiss their legacy too harshly. Beneath all the absurdity and hypocrisy, Victorian manners gave us something enduring. The idea that courtesy could hold a society together. Their etiquette may have been suffocating, but it was also an attempt, however clumsy, to create order in a chaotic industrial world. They believed politeness could bridge class divides, soothe conflict, and make daily life slightly less dreadful. So the next time you find yourself nervously laughing when someone waves and you're not sure it's for you, or apologising to a chair you bumped into, you can thank the Victorians. They may have left us their prudish ghosts and impossible standards, but they also gave us the blueprint for civility in a crowded, unpredictable world. In their absence, we still perform, only now our ballroom is global, our audience infinite, and our etiquette digital, and somewhere, Queen Victoria is watching from the afterlife, unimpressed but quietly relieved that at least for the most part, we're still behaving.